A letter delivered to Pope Alexander III in 1177 claimed it came from Prester John, a Christian emperor ruling an unimaginably wealthy kingdom somewhere beyond the known world. Kings believed it. Expeditions searched for it. And yet no one could ever prove the man behind the signature had existed at all. That unanswered question is only the beginning. Across these 22 mysteries, you'll encounter vanished rulers, impossible artifacts, forgotten cities, baffling disappearances, and discoveries that still divide historians centuries later. Some survived because the evidence disappeared. Others remain unsolved because every new clue raises even more questions. The deeper you go, the stranger the past becomes. It starts with the king whose greatest legacy may have been a name. The letter survives today only in copies. Hundreds of them, scattered across European archives, translated and retranslated into Latin, French, German, and half a dozen other languages, multiplying across the continent faster than any single scribe could have managed alone. No original has ever been found. No signature has ever been authenticated. And yet, in the year 1165, this letter landed in the hands of the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope himself, each of whom apparently took it seriously enough to respond, or at least to preserve it for posterity. The letter's author identified himself as Prester John. Prester, a variant of presbyter, meaning priest, a Christian king of almost unimaginable wealth and power, ruling a vast empire somewhere beyond the reach of the Islamic caliphates that stood between Europe and the East. His letter described a kingdom stretching across 72 provinces, a river running with gems instead of water, a fountain of youth within his palace grounds, and an army so large it could sweep in from the east and crush the enemies of Christendom once and for all. To a Europe locked in generations of conflict with Muslim powers across the Mediterranean and the Holy Land, the promise was intoxicating. A mighty ally, already Christian, already victorious, waiting somewhere beyond the horizon to turn the tide of the entire struggle. The trouble, of course, is that no such kingdom has ever been found. No archaeological trace of Prester John's court, his river of gems, or his 72 provinces has ever surfaced, and that absence hasn't stopped anyone from looking. For the first few centuries after the letter appeared, most European scholars and monarchs assumed Prester John's kingdom lay somewhere in Asia, perhaps connected to the Christian communities known to exist in parts of India, or to rumors filtering back from Mongol-controlled territories following the campaigns of Genghis Khan in the early 1200s. Some medieval writers speculated Prester John might be a garbled European memory of a real historical figure, possibly Yeludashi, the 12th century founder of the Kara-Kitai Empire in Central Asia, whose military victory over a Muslim Seljuk army in 1141 did, in fact, send shockwaves and rumors rippling westward at almost exactly the moment the letter first appeared. The timing is suggestive. The details, however, line up with almost nothing else about Yeludashi's actual empire, which was not Christian and bore little resemblance to the fantastical kingdom described in the letter. By the 14th and 15th centuries, as Asia proved stubbornly free of any such kingdom, the search shifted decisively southward and westward toward Ethiopia, a genuinely Christian kingdom, ancient and powerful, largely unknown in detail to most of medieval Europe. Portuguese explorers in the 1400s and 1500s actively sought out the Ethiopian emperor as the true Prester John, and for a time the identification stuck. European maps labeled Ethiopia's ruler as Prester John well into the 1600s, even after direct contact revealed an empire considerably different from the one described in the original letter. Was the letter, then, simply an elaborate hoax? a piece of political propaganda designed to bolster crusading morale during a difficult period, as many modern historians now suspect? Or did it encode a genuine, badly garbled rumor of a real, distant power, reshaped by centuries of retelling into something unrecognizable? No conclusive answer has ever emerged. What remains is the letter itself, endlessly copied, endlessly believed, describing a kingdom that inspired 4 centuries of expeditions toward a throne no explorer ever actually found. From the endlessly copied letter of a phantom king, the story moves to a place that needed no letter to draw kings toward it, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and specifically the vast vaulted substructure beneath its southeastern corner, a cavernous space of Herodian-era stone arches that Crusader-era visitors would come to call Solomon's Stables. In 1119, a small group of French knights led by Hugues de Payan presented themselves to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, requesting permission to establish a military order dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims traveling the roads to the Holy City. Baldwin granted them more than a mission. He granted them a headquarters, and not just any building. He gave them the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the platform surrounding it, a site Crusaders believed stood atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple itself, destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD and never rebuilt. The knights took their name directly from this location. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, soon shortened to simply the Knights Templar. For an order ostensibly founded to escort pilgrims along dangerous roads, the Templars' earliest documented activity is strikingly disconnected from that stated purpose. Contemporary accounts and later archaeological investigation both point to something unusual happening beneath their new headquarters almost immediately: sustained excavation into the vaulted chambers and tunnels running underneath the temple platform. Work substantial enough that 19th century British surveyors, centuries later, would find Crusader-era pottery, tools, and construction debris deep within the substructure. Evidence of tunneling activity that had no obvious connection to fortification, pilgrim housing, or any of the mundane logistical needs a new military order stationed in a foreign city might reasonably have. What were 9, or perhaps as few as 9, founding knights? Historical sources genuinely disagree on the order's earliest membership numbers, doing with picks and shovels beneath one of the most sacred and contested plots of ground in the medieval world. The mainstream historical explanation is comparatively modest. The Templars needed stable housing and storage space, and the ancient vaults beneath the temple platform, structurally sound and already partially excavated by Herodian and later Roman builders a millennium earlier, offered exactly that. Clearing debris and expanding existing chambers for stables, quarters, and storage would have been practical, unglamorous work, fully consistent with a small, under-resourced new order making the most of the real estate King Baldwin had granted them. But the location itself has fueled a persistent alternative theory, one considerably harder to prove and just as hard to dismiss outright: that the Temple Mount excavations were never primarily about stable space at all, but about searching for something specific believed to be hidden beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple. Medieval and later legend held that the original temple, before its destruction, had housed treasures of extraordinary significance, the Ark of the Covenant among them, according to some traditions, along with sacred texts, ritual objects, or relics tied directly to the temple's biblical history. Crusader-era Europe was steeped in exactly this kind of relic culture, an environment where the search for physical, tangible connections to biblical events carried enormous religious and political weight, and where a newly formed order occupying the literal ruins of Solomon's Temple would have had every symbolic incentive to search beneath their own feet for something extraordinary. No account from the period explicitly states what, if anything, the Templars found. This absence is precisely where the speculation has flourished for 9 centuries. Some later writers and fringe historians have proposed the Templars discovered something during these early excavations, substantial enough to explain the order's remarkably rapid rise to wealth and influence in the years immediately following. From 9 impoverished founding knights to, within roughly a decade, an organization powerful enough to receive direct papal endorsement and sweeping legal privileges through the 1139 papal bull Omni Datum Optimum, which placed the Templars outside the authority of local bishops and kings entirely, answerable only to the Pope himself. That trajectory, undeniably fast by the standards of any medieval institution, has never been fully explained through conventional means alone, and the gap between 9 knights with limited resources and an order suddenly wealthy and influential enough to warrant unprecedented papal protection is real, whatever its actual cause. Mainstream historians generally attribute the Templars' rapid rise to a combination of aggressive, highly effective fundraising across Europe, substantial land and property donations from noble patrons eager to support the Crusader cause, and the order's early adoption of what amounted to sophisticated financial and logistical infrastructure, the beginnings of the international banking and transport network the Templars would become famous for in later decades. None of this requires buried treasure to explain, and yet the excavations themselves remain a documented physical fact. Tunnels dug, debris cleared, chambers expanded, by an order whose founding charter said nothing about archaeology, in the exact location medieval Europe believed held the physical remnants of the most significant religious structure in the biblical world. 19th-century explorers and various archaeological and pseudo-archaeological expeditions in the decades since have continued probing the same substructure beneath the Temple Mount, searching for evidence of exactly what the Templars might have found, removed, or left behind 8 centuries ago. None has produced conclusive proof of anything beyond the tunneling itself. What remains, then, is a very real, very physical set of excavated chambers beneath one of the most fought-over patches of ground on Earth, dug by men who left no explanation for their work, in a place where an entire medieval world believed something extraordinary might still be waiting to be found. Wind. That is the sound this chapter opens on. A low, constant wind moving across empty grass, rattling loose stone, finding nothing to stop it. Picture a fjord in southern Greenland, its water so still it seems to hold its breath. Along the shoreline, the grass grows thick and green in the brief Arctic summer, and if you walk far enough inland, you will find them. Low mounds of turf and stone, barely distinguishable from the hills around them. These are the remains of houses, byres, churches, a cathedral even, Gardar, with its red sandstone arches still standing after 800 years. This is what remains of the Western settlement, one of 2 colonies founded by Norse settlers who crossed from Iceland at the end of the 10th century, following in the wake of Eric the Red. And for nearly 400 years they lived here. Then, sometime in the first half of the 14th century, they vanished. Not gradually. Not, as far as the evidence shows, in the way a struggling settlement fades, with slow abandonment, with families trickling away one by one. The Western settlement appears to have gone silent all at once. The facts we do have are precise enough to be haunting. In 1721, a Norwegian missionary named Hans Egede sailed to Greenland, expecting to find descendants of the Norse Christians who had settled there centuries before. He found no one. The eastern settlement further south had already been known to be gone. But it was the fate of the western settlement that first alerted the wider world that something had gone deeply wrong in Norse Greenland, because an account survives written by a priest named Ivar Barderson around 1350, describing a journey he made to the western settlement on the order of the Bishop of Gardar. He went to investigate reports of trouble. What he found, according to the account, was nothing. No people, no struggle, only livestock wandering loose among empty houses with no one left to tend them. Livestock left alive, not slaughtered, not driven off, not gathered for a hasty departure. Simply left, as though whoever had once fed and milked them had stepped out one day and never returned. What could account for an entire community disappearing so completely that even their animals were left behind? The most widely accepted explanations begin, reasonably enough, with the climate. Tree ring and ice core data confirm that the medieval warm period, which had allowed the Norse to farm this far north, was giving way, by the 1300s, to the onset of what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age. Growing seasons shortened. Hay yields, essential for keeping cattle alive through the winter, would have dropped. Sea ice, expanding southward, may have choked off the shipping routes to Norway and Iceland that the settlers depended on for trade, particularly for the iron they could not produce themselves. Then there is the matter of walrus ivory. For much of the settlement's history, it had been Greenland's most valuable export, prized across Europe as an alternative to elephant ivory. But by the 14th century, trade routes to Africa had reopened, and African ivory flooded European markets, cheaper and more accessible. The economic foundation the Western settlement depended on may simply have crumbled beneath it, a colony surviving on a single export, watching that export lose its value continent by continent, market by market. Some archaeologists point to the Norse relationship with the neighboring Inuit, the Thule people, whose expansion southward coincided with the Norse decline. Were relations hostile? Some sagas hint at conflict. Others suggest the opposite, that trade or even integration may have taken place, and that some Norse Greenlanders did not vanish so much as they assimilated, disappearing into Inuit communities whose way of life was far better adapted to a cooling Arctic. But climate and commerce and conflict, however compelling, strain to explain everything Ivar Bardarson describes. A community does not typically vanish overnight because their crops failed. Starvation leaves bones. Disease leaves graves. Where are the dead of the Western settlement? Excavations at the sites have found remarkably few human remains for a population that once numbered, by some estimates, several hundred people. Some researchers have proposed a swifter catastrophe, a final fatal winter, a famine so absolute that the last survivors fled overland to the eastern settlement, or attempted the sea crossing home and were lost. Others have raised the possibility of plague, though no clear evidence has surfaced to confirm it reached so remote a colony. And then there are the theories that live at the edges of the historical record, speculative, unproven, but persistent. Some have wondered whether the settlers were taken, in some sense, by the very Inuit groups with whom relations are so poorly documented. Others have asked whether some environmental catastrophe, a volcanic event, or a sudden climatic shock more severe than the models suggest, struck faster and harder than the archaeological record can reveal. None of these ideas commands scholarly consensus. All of them share a discomfort with the same unresolved detail: the silence of the livestock, wandering the empty pastures, with no one left to call them home. What we are left with, in the end, is a scattering of turf walls sinking slowly back into Greenland soil, a bishop's cathedral standing empty under a Nordic sky, and a single medieval account of a priest walking into a village that had somehow ceased, entirely and without warning, to exist. Perhaps the truth lies quietly in the ice cores and the tree rings, in hunger and trade and a changing world. Or perhaps something happened in that fjord that the historical record was never meant to capture at all. Either way, the grass still grows over the mounds. And whatever walked away from the Western settlement in those final days left no footprints for us to follow. Footprints that leave no trace. That was the question we were left with in Greenland. and it is a question that finds no easier answer beneath the stones of Jerusalem. Picture a narrow stairwell cut into bedrock, descending beneath the old city, the air growing cooler and staler with every step. The walls here are ancient, some cut by Herodian masons 2,000 years ago, others reinforced or reshaped centuries later by hands whose names were never recorded. Jerusalem sits atop a labyrinth. Cisterns, tunnels, quarries, burial vaults, a subterranean city layered beneath the visible one, built and rebuilt across 3,000 years of conquest, destruction, and reconstruction. Much of it has been mapped. Much of it has not. When Crusader forces took Jerusalem in 1099, and again during the periods of Frankish rule that followed, chroniclers wrote of chambers beneath the city that unsettled even battle-hardened knights. Some of these references are straightforward enough: storerooms, cisterns, and the substructures beneath the Temple Mount that the Templars themselves are known to have used as stables and quarters. A vaulted space still known today as Solomon's Stables. But other references are stranger. Certain Crusader-era accounts, along with later pilgrim narratives, speak of passages that seem to lead further than expected. Chambers sealed off, avoided, or spoken of with a caution that goes beyond simple military caution. Why would soldiers occupying a fortified city take pains to avoid certain rooms beneath their own feet? The verified history offers a partial answer. Jerusalem's bedrock is riddled with ancient quarries, some dating to the First Temple period, from which the city's massive building stones were cut. Over centuries, some of these voids were repurposed as cisterns, others as tombs, others simply abandoned and forgotten as street levels rose and city plans changed. It is a well-documented phenomenon. An underground void, once purposeful, becomes disconnected from living memory, then rediscovered generations later by people who no longer know what it was for. When the Templars arrived, is it possible they were simply encountering pre-existing spaces whose original function had already been lost to time, and reacting with the wariness anyone might feel entering an unmapped void beneath an ancient, sacred, war-torn city? That explanation satisfies much of what the record shows, but it does not entirely satisfy all of it. Modern excavations beneath the Temple Mount's western and southern flanks, along with tunnel surveys conducted through the 20th and 21st centuries, have confirmed that portions of the ancient substructure remain unexplored or inaccessible, some for reasons of religious sensitivity, some for structural safety, some simply because political and religious tensions in the region make comprehensive archaeological survey of the Temple Mount itself all but impossible. Archaeologists agree, without much controversy, that spaces exist beneath Jerusalem's old city that have not been entered in the modern era. What is far less agreed upon is what precisely those spaces contain, because the honest answer, in most cases, is that no one currently knows. It is here that the historical trail begins to blur into legend. Templar tradition, much of it emerging centuries after the fact, and treated with real skepticism by mainstream historians, holds that the order's early years in Jerusalem, spent quartered atop the Temple Mount, involved excavation work beneath the ruins of the ancient temple itself. Some later writers have connected this to persistent, unproven claims about relics or artifacts the Templars may have sought or found there. Scholars are largely unified in treating these claims as later embellishment, myth grown up around a genuinely mysterious set of ruins, whose original purpose invited speculation precisely because so little was documented at the time. And yet the underlying fact that gave the legends their foothold remains undisputed. The Templars did occupy the Temple Mount. They did have access to spaces beneath it that are now closed to investigation, and the written record from their own era is frustratingly thin on what exactly they encountered down there. Beyond the Temple Mount, other tales persist, of tunnels said to connect distant points across the old city, of chambers glimpsed briefly during construction projects and then sealed again for safety or reburied beneath new foundations, of local traditions describing passages whose entrances no longer exist, or exist but are no longer remembered. Some of this is almost certainly folklore, shaped by a city where every layer of soil holds genuine ruins, and where genuine mystery blurs easily into invented mystery. But Jerusalem is also a city where genuine archaeological surprises continue to occur. Sealed cisterns discovered during modern construction, forgotten tunnels rediscovered by utility crews, ancient walls found beneath buildings whose owners had no idea what lay beneath their floors. The city has a documented habit of concealing things far longer than anyone expects, and revealing them only by accident. So when medieval chroniclers wrote of chambers that unsettled them, chambers avoided or spoken of in hushed terms, were they describing nothing more than the ordinary unease of stepping into an unmapped, silent space beneath an ancient and violent city? Or were they recording something else, some detail now lost to us, some encounter that never made it fully into the surviving texts, edited out, garbled in translation, or simply left unwritten by men who preferred not to commit it to parchment at all? The tunnels beneath Jerusalem are still being mapped, slowly, carefully, and often incompletely, hindered as much by politics and reverence as by stone and soil. Some chambers remain sealed, some are simply unreachable, and somewhere beneath the weight of 3,000 years of habitation, it is entirely possible that a space exists which no living person has entered, waiting, as it has waited for centuries, for someone to finally open the door. It was the Templars themselves who left that door unopened beneath Jerusalem, and it is the Templars who carry us forward now, out of the tunnels and into a mystery that has outlived the order itself by 7 centuries. Picture a small stone strongroom in Paris, its heavy door bound in iron, somewhere within the walls of the Paris Temple. The Order's European headquarters, a fortress-like compound that once stood where the Marais district now spreads its quiet streets. By the early 1300s, this was reportedly one of the most secure treasuries in Christendom. Kings deposited funds here. The Order's own wealth, accumulated over 2 centuries of donations, tithes, and financial dealings across Europe and the Levant, was said to be held within its vaults. And on the night of October 12, 1307, the eve of the mass arrests that would destroy the Knights Templar on the orders of King Philip IV of France, that treasury was, by multiple accounts, already empty. Empty or emptied. The distinction matters, and historians have never fully resolved it. The verified history is substantial enough on its own. The Templars, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, grew within 2 centuries into one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated financial institutions in medieval Europe, pioneers in many respects of an early banking system, capable of issuing letters of credit that allowed a pilgrim to deposit funds in Paris and withdraw the equivalent in Acre or Jerusalem. That kind of network required real infrastructure: ledgers, couriers, secure storage, trusted agents. When Philip IV, deeply in debt to the Order and eager to seize its assets, ordered the simultaneous arrest of Templars across France, he was reportedly counting on capturing that wealth in one decisive stroke. He did not. Chroniclers of the period note that when royal officials moved to seize the Paris Temple, the treasury contained far less than expected. Some historians attribute this to unremarkable causes. The Order's assets were never as liquid or centralized as legend later assumed, much of its wealth existing as land holdings, debts owed, and property scattered across hundreds of commanderies, rather than as stacked coin in a single vault. It is entirely possible, mainstream historians argue, that there was simply no great hoard to find, because the Order's true wealth was never the kind of treasure the word conjures. And yet the timing invites a harder question. Jacques de Molay, the order's last Grand Master, appears to have had some advance warning that the arrests were coming. Accounts suggest a degree of preparation, however limited, in the days before October 13th. If word had reached the Paris temple even briefly ahead of the raid, could something have been moved? Some chronicles from the period speak, with varying degrees of reliability, of wagons leaving the temple in the preceding nights, and of ships departing from the port of La Rochelle, a Templar stronghold on France's Atlantic coast, in the same narrow window of time. No definitive record confirms what those wagons carried or where those ships were bound. But the accounts exist, persistent enough across independent sources that historians have never been able to dismiss them entirely, nor confirm them. This is where the trail splits into its most enduring legends. One tradition holds that Templar wealth, along with the Order's ships, made its way to Scotland, a kingdom then under papal excommunication and largely beyond Rome's immediate reach. Fertile ground, so the theory goes, for fugitive knights seeking refuge beyond the authority that had condemned them. Architectural oddities at sites like Rosslyn Chapel, built more than a century after the Order's suppression, have been cited by some as evidence of a continued Templar presence, carvings interpreted as coded references to treasure or tradition. Mainstream historians remain broadly skeptical of this connection, noting the significant gap in time and the absence of direct documentary evidence linking the chapel's builders to the historical Templars. Still, the theory persists, in part because Scotland's political isolation at that exact moment in history is a documented fact, whatever one makes of what it implies. A second, older thread of speculation reaches back further still, to the Order's earliest years in Jerusalem, when the first 9 knights were quartered, as we've seen, above the ruins of the ancient temple, with access to substructures beneath it that remain only partially explored to this day. Some have long wondered whether the origins of Templar wealth trace back not to European donations at all, but to something recovered during those early years beneath the Temple Mount, an idea that has fueled centuries of legend involving lost relics and ancient treasure, and one that serious historians treat with considerable caution, given how thin the contemporary evidence is. But the underlying, undisputed fact remains. Those early years are among the least documented in the Order's history, and what the first Templars actually did in the chambers beneath Jerusalem was never fully recorded by anyone who lived to explain it. What became of the wealth of the Paris temple has never been definitively established. No hoard has ever been recovered bearing verifiable Templar provenance. No document has surfaced confirming where the wagons went or what the ships at La Rochelle carried into the Atlantic dark. Perhaps there was no great treasure to hide at all, only the ordinary, unglamorous truth of a medieval institution whose wealth was never as simple as gold. Or perhaps, somewhere between a sealed chamber in Jerusalem and a quiet coastline in France, something did leave without a trace, and is still waiting 700 years later to be found. Ships vanishing into the Atlantic dark, and that is where we left off. Let us follow one further back, 3 centuries earlier, to a different coastline and a different set of vessels whose voyages ended in a silence just as complete. Picture a low grassy terrace on the northern tip of Newfoundland, where the land meets the sea in a wide, wind-scoured bay. Beneath the turf here, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 8 timber-framed buildings, laid out in a pattern unmistakably Norse. Long halls, a smithy, evidence of ironworking and boat repair. This is Los Olmedos, confirmed in the 1960s as the only certifiedly Norse settlement site in North America, dated by tree ring and radiocarbon analysis to around the year 1000. It is, by every reasonable measure, physical proof that Leif Erikson and his contemporaries reached a land they called Vinland 5 centuries before Columbus. And yet, for all that certainty, What happened here afterward remains one of the more curious blank spaces in medieval history. The Icelandic sagas, the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, both committed to writing 2 centuries or more after the events they describe, tell us that Norse expeditions to Vinland were not a single voyage but several, spanning perhaps a decade or more. They describe rich timber, wild grapes, favorable land. They also describe conflict, encounters with people the Norse called Skraelings, likely ancestors of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, or related indigenous peoples of the region. And they describe, ultimately, abandonment. According to the sagas, the Norse simply decided the land, however rich, was not worth the cost of holding it against a population they could not overcome and could not, apparently, coexist with. It is a clean explanation, and not an unreasonable one. But archaeology complicates it, as archaeology so often does. Los Olmedos itself shows evidence of only brief occupation, likely a handful of years, functioning perhaps as a base camp or way station rather than a true colony. This fits the saga account reasonably well. What doesn't fit as neatly is the mounting evidence, still debated among specialists, that Norse activity in North America may have extended well beyond this one site and beyond the short window the sagas imply. Butternut remains, a species that does not grow anywhere near Newfoundland, but does grow further south and west, around the Gulf of St. Lawrence, have been found at Los Olmedos, suggesting Norse expeditions ranged considerably further than the single settlement the excavation has revealed. If they traveled that far, did they establish other camps? Other footholds, however brief, that have simply never been found, buried beneath centuries of forest growth and shifting coastline? Some researchers have proposed exactly that. A site at Point Rosie, further south on Newfoundland, generated considerable excitement in 2016 when aerial and satellite imaging suggested possible Norse ironworking activity, only for subsequent excavation to conclude the features were more likely natural or from other periods entirely, a reminder of how easily hope can outpace evidence in this field. No second confirmed Norse site has yet been found anywhere in North America beyond Los Olmedos, and yet the butternuts remain, alongside a scattering of other tantalizing contested clues, a scraping of Norse-style ironwork here, a disputed artifact there, that have never been definitively confirmed nor entirely dismissed. There is also the matter of oral tradition, harder still to weigh on any scale of evidence. Some indigenous communities along the eastern seaboard carry stories, passed down long before European contact was formally recorded, of pale strangers arriving by sea in the distant past. Stories that some researchers treat as possible folk memory of Norse encounters, and that others caution against reading too literally, given how easily such tales can be reshaped or reinterpreted across centuries of retelling. Neither position can be proven from the material record alone. What the stories do confirm, at minimum, is that contact between 2 very different peoples along that coastline was significant enough to be remembered in some form, in some communities, long after the details themselves had blurred. Why, then, did the Norse truly leave? The sagas point to violence and isolation, a colony too distant from Greenland's already fragile supply lines, facing a population too numerous and too capable to be displaced by a few dozen settlers. This explanation aligns with what we know of Norse expansion elsewhere. They thrived where land was empty or thinly populated, as in Iceland and parts of Greenland, and struggled wherever they met organized resistance. Vinland, rich as it was, may simply have been defended by people the Norse had no real capacity to overcome. Yet, questions remain that the sagas, written so long after the fact by authors more interested in narrative than in precise chronology, cannot fully answer. How many voyages were there truly? How long did Norse presence in North America actually last? Years? Or, as some have speculated based on the wider scatter of possible evidence, longer? Did contact between Norse settlers and indigenous peoples end entirely with the abandonment described in the sagas? Or did some quieter, less documented interaction continue in ways that left no clear trace in either oral tradition? And what became of whatever camps, if any, existed beyond Los Olmedos? Did the land simply reclaim them, the timber rotting, the turf walls collapsing back into hillsides indistinguishable from the country around them? Los Olmedos stands today as confirmed, undeniable proof that Norse sailors crossed an ocean and touched a continent 500 years before it was declared discovered by anyone else. But it stands almost alone, a single point of certainty in a much larger, much darker unknown. Somewhere along that coastline, in the space between one grassy terrace and the wider land the sagas describe, the story of Vinland trails off into silence, and the ground, as it so often does in these mysteries, has yet to say whether it is still keeping something back. A century and a bit before Columbus, and 8 decades before any Norse sail would touch that Newfoundland shore we've just left. One November night in 1120, in the cold waters off the Norman coast, an entire royal succession went to the bottom of the sea in the space of a few minutes. Picture the harbor at Barfleur, on the northern tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, as dusk falls on the 25th of November. A ship called the White Ship, swift, newly refitted, offered personally to King Henry I of England by its captain Thomas Fitzstephen, whose own father had captained the vessel that carried Henry's father, William the Conqueror, across this same channel decades before. That night, the ship carried a cargo far more valuable than cargo usually is. William Adelin, the 17-year-old only legitimate son of King Henry I and heir to the thrones of England and Normandy, along with dozens of the kingdom's young nobility, his half-siblings, cousins, and companions, the next generation of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy gathered together in one hull. Contemporary chroniclers, writing not long after the event, describe a crew and passengers who had spent the evening drinking, eager to outpace the king's own ship, which had already departed. The White Ship left port late, in darkness, sailing fast to make up the distance. It never reached England. Within minutes of leaving Barfleur, the ship struck a submerged rock, the Quilebue, well known to local sailors, and capsized in the freezing water just offshore. What followed, according to the chronicles, was a catastrophe compressed into moments. Nearly everyone aboard drowned in sight of the shore, within earshot of the port they had just left. Contemporary accounts number the dead at close to 300, though medieval casualty figures should always be read with some caution. Among them was William Adelin, Henry's only legitimate son and heir. The English succession, secured just hours before, had been thrown into the sea. The verified history of what followed is substantial, and reads like the plot of a tragedy already written. Henry IV's chroniclers tell us never smiled again after learning the news. Without a male heir, he was forced to name his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as successor, an arrangement the Norman and English nobility accepted only reluctantly, given the near-total absence of precedent for a reigning queen. When Henry died in 1135, that reluctance erupted into open civil war, a 19-year conflict later called the Anarchy, fought between Matilda and her cousin Stephen of Blois, a war so devastating that contemporary writers described it as a time when Christ and his saints slept. All of that, a generation of civil war, the eventual rise of the Plantagenet dynasty through Matilda's son Henry II, traces back, in the tidy logic of causation that historians are usually wary of trusting too completely, to a ship that sank in sight of land on a clear November night. But it is the matter of the survivors, or rather, the almost complete absence of them, that leaves the more unsettling questions. Only one person is recorded to have survived the wreck of the White Ship, a butcher from Rouen named Berold, who had boarded to collect debts owed to him and who clung to a spar through the freezing night until he was rescued the following morning, becoming the sole source for much of what we know about the ship's final hours. Every other account of that night, the panic, the failed rescue attempt, the fate of individual passengers, descends from chroniclers writing after the fact, piecing together second-hand testimony, court rumor, and grief. One particularly haunting detail recurs across several accounts. William Adelin himself was reportedly pulled into a small boat and might have escaped, only to turn back toward the sinking ship upon hearing the cries of his half-sister, the Countess of Perche, still trapped aboard, and in the chaos of others trying to climb into his boat to save themselves, it capsized, and he drowned along with everyone else. Whether this detail is a faithful record of what happened, or a moralizing embellishment added by chroniclers eager to give the tragedy a redemptive shape, is impossible now to determine with certainty. And that uncertainty is where the mystery, such as it is, truly lives. Why did a ship crewed by experienced Norman sailors, in waters they knew intimately, strike a rock whose location was common local knowledge? The chronicler's answer, drunkenness, recklessness, a fatal desire to overtake the king's ship in darkness, is plausible and broadly accepted by historians, but it rests almost entirely on second-hand report, filtered through decades of retelling by writers with their own reasons to draw a moral from the wreck. Some later historians have wondered whether court politics played any hidden role at all, whether any of Henry's rivals, chafing under his rule, might have seen advantage in the loss of his heir, though no evidence beyond speculation has ever supported such a theory, and most scholars regard it as exactly that: speculation born of the very human instinct to look for a hand behind a catastrophe too consequential to feel accidental. More quietly troubling still is the matter of the dead who were never recovered. Medieval accounts note that many bodies, including that of William Adelin himself, were never found, consumed by the channel's cold currents, or perhaps never freed from the wreck at all, which is believed to still lie somewhere off Barfleur, its exact location never conclusively identified despite periodic searches over the centuries. An entire vessel, carrying the flower of Anglo-Norman youth, remains unlocated on the floor of a channel that ships have crossed continuously for 900 years. Was it simple human error, drink, arrogance, a moonless night, and a rock every local sailor should have known to avoid? Or does something else lie beneath that stretch of water, some detail the chroniclers never recorded or chose not to? The wreck of the White Ship reshaped the succession of England as thoroughly as any battle, and yet its own physical remains and the fullest truth of what happened aboard it that November night have never surfaced at all. Some 800 miles south and east of that cold Norman Channel, along a different coastline entirely, another kind of loss was unfolding in these same medieval centuries. Not a single vessel sinking in an instant, but an entire library disappearing, book by book, over the course of generations. Picture the House of Knowledge in Cairo, Dar al-Ilm, founded in the year 1005 by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, at the height of a dynasty that ruled much of North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean from a city they had built specifically to be their capital. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe a collection almost impossible to picture in full. Some medieval sources claim the Fatimid palace libraries in Cairo held well over 1 million volumes, spanning theology, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and history, gathered through purchase, diplomacy, and the systematic patronage of scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond. Whatever the precise number, and medieval figures, as always, should be treated with appropriate caution. The scale, described by multiple independent chroniclers, points to one of the largest libraries assembled anywhere in the medieval world, a repository that rivaled or surpassed the great libraries of antiquity that had come before it. And then, within the span of a few catastrophic years in the late 1060s, it was gone. The verified history here is unusually well documented, if still riddled with gaps. The Fatimid Caliphate, by the 1060s, was in severe political and financial crisis, a prolonged famine, remembered in Egyptian chronicles as al-Shida al-Uzma, or the Great Calamity, had gutted the treasury and left the state unable to pay its own soldiers. Contemporary historians describe what followed as a slow institutional collapse. Unpaid Turkish and Berber military factions, increasingly restive, are recorded as having turned on the palace itself, and among the assets seized to cover unpaid wages was the Caliphate library. Chroniclers, writing in the following decades, describe books being sold off by the armload, their bindings stripped for the leather and gold tooling, their pages used, according to some accounts, as fuel, as a wrapping material, even as makeshift shoe soles for soldiers marching through a city that could no longer feed or pay them. It is one of the more quietly devastating images in medieval historiography. Sacred and scientific texts, gathered over 60 years by scholars and caliphs alike, disassembled by desperate men for the value of their materials rather than their contents. By most scholarly accounts, only a small fraction of the original collection is thought to have survived this dispersal in any organized form, scattered into private hands, absorbed into other regional libraries, or lost outright. And yet, the story does not end quite so simply, because the historical record leaves real ambiguity about exactly how much was destroyed, how much was sold intact rather than dismantled, and where the surviving material ultimately went. Some manuscripts bearing Fatimid provenance marks have surfaced over the following centuries in libraries across the Islamic world, in Damascus, in Aleppo, occasionally further afield, raising an obvious question historians have never been able to fully resolve. Were these isolated survivors, individual volumes that happened to escape the chaos of the 1060s through sale or gift before the worst of the collapse? Or do they hint at something larger, an intact portion of the collection, quietly removed and preserved by scholars or officials who saw what was coming and acted before the soldiers arrived? Some historians have proposed that portions of the library may have been deliberately relocated, whether to allied courts, to private scholarly collections, or to religious institutions positioned to protect them from seizure. This remains plausible in principle. Medieval scholars and officials elsewhere are well documented to have taken exactly this kind of preemptive action during periods of political collapse. But no clear documentary trail confirms it happened here, at this scale, with this collection. There is also the specific and long-debated question of what became of the Fatimids' own scientific and astronomical instruments and texts, reportedly extensive given the dynasty's noted patronage of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Certain later medieval bibliographers reference specific titles associated with the Fatimid court that cannot be definitively traced to any surviving manuscript today, works known only by title and second-hand description, their contents effectively vanished along with whatever else the library once held. Are these genuinely lost, destroyed in the dispersal of the 1060s along with everything else, or might they yet survive, unrecognized, in some regional manuscript collection where their Fatimid origins were stripped away, along with their original bindings, their provenance forgotten by later owners who saw only an old and useful text? It is a question that continues to animate manuscript historians today, because the broader pattern is well established. Medieval Islamic manuscript collections were routinely recopied, rebound, and recirculated across centuries and across an enormous geographic range, often losing clear markers of their original origin in the process. A text copied from a Fatimid original in, say, the 13th century, and recopied again in the 16th, may carry no obvious trace of the palace library it ultimately descends from. Somewhere in the vast, still incompletely catalogued manuscript holdings of libraries from Istanbul to Cairo to distant private collections, it is entirely plausible that fragments of Dar al-Ilm's original holdings persist, unidentified, waiting for the right scholar to recognize a phrase, a marginal note, a binding style that finally connects an anonymous old text back to a library that supposedly ceased to exist nearly 1,000 years ago. What we know for certain is stark enough on its own. One of the great libraries of the medieval world was dismantled within a matter of years, its contents scattered by soldiers who needed leather and gold more than they needed books. What we do not know is whether that dismantling was truly as total as the chronicles suggest, or whether some quieter, more deliberate act of preservation happened alongside the destruction. A handful of scholars, perhaps, working in the last available hours to save what they could, leaving behind a trail so faint that it has taken on the shape of an open question rather than a settled fact. Somewhere, perhaps, a page of that vanished library still exists, its true origin unknown even to the hands that now hold it. A page whose true origin is unknown even to the hands that now hold it. Let that same idea take physical form once more, this time not in paper but in stone, carved so precisely that its origins remain debated to this day. Picture the highlands of northern Ethiopia, some 2,500 meters above sea level, where the town of Lalibela sits scattered across a landscape of red volcanic rock. Here, sunk directly into the earth rather than built upon it, stand 11 churches, each carved downward from a single mass of stone, isolated entirely from the surrounding rock by deep trenches cut on every side. There is no masonry here, no stacked block, no mortar joint. Each structure, walls, columns, windows, roof, interior chambers, even the carved reliefs decorating their surfaces, was excavated as one continuous piece, meaning the builders worked from the top down, chiseling doorways and ceilings and staircases out of solid volcanic tuff long before the building beneath them existed in any conventional sense. Beit Georgis, the Church of St. George, is perhaps the most striking example. A perfect cross-shaped structure, carved some 12 meters down into the rock, its roofline level with the surrounding ground, invisible until a visitor stands directly at its edge and looks down into the pit that contains it. According to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, all 11 churches were commissioned by King Lalibela in the late 12th or early 13th century, intended as a kind of New Jerusalem carved into the Ethiopian highlands after Muslim conquests made pilgrimage to the actual Jerusalem increasingly difficult for Ethiopian Christians. This much aligns reasonably well with the historical record. Lalibela was a real historical figure, a king of the Zagwe dynasty, and the churches bear architectural and iconographic features consistent with the construction period in the 12th and 13th centuries. Ethiopian hagiographic texts, along with later chronicles, credit the king directly with overseeing the project, framing it as an act of profound religious devotion carried out during his reign. What these same traditions also claim, however, is considerably harder to verify and considerably harder to dismiss outright. According to long-standing Ethiopian oral and written tradition, the churches were completed in roughly 23 years, an extraordinarily short span given the sheer volume of solid rock that had to be removed, chiseled, and finished to a remarkably high standard of precision across all 11 structures. And the same tradition offers an explanation for how this was possible, that angels worked alongside the human laborers, carving by day what the workers had begun, and continuing the work through the night while the human builders slept, so that each morning revealed progress beyond what a single day's labor could reasonably account for. Modern archaeologists and engineers naturally look for more grounded explanations, and there are some to be found. Ethiopia's volcanic tuff, while requiring skilled labor to work, is considerably softer than granite or limestone, making large-scale excavation more feasible than it might first appear. It is also increasingly accepted among specialists that the site was not built in a single uninterrupted campaign under one king's reign, as the tradition suggests, but was more likely developed in phases, potentially beginning before Lalibela's rule and continuing after it, drawing on generations of accumulated labor and expertise in working the local stone. Some researchers have pointed to earlier religious or defensive excavation on the site, proposing that certain chambers may have originated as something other than churches, quarries, or even fortifications before being reworked and consecrated during Lalibela's reign. If true, this would explain some of the apparent speed. The builders were not always starting from an unmarked cliff face, but adapting and expanding structures that already existed in some form. And yet, even these more grounded theories leave real gaps. The engineering precision on display, perfectly proportioned cruciform floor plans, drainage systems still functioning today, aligned windows and columns cut with a consistency difficult to achieve, even when working top-down with modern tools, has led some architectural historians to ask how a workforce of the 12th century, without iron tools stronger than what was locally available, without any comparable large-scale rock-hewn tradition elsewhere in the region to draw technical precedent from, achieved results of this caliber. Ethiopia had no preceding tradition of monolithic church architecture on this scale. There is no clear technological lineage connecting Lalibela's churches to an earlier body of similar work elsewhere in Africa or the wider Christian world, which leaves historians in the unusual position of examining a masterwork with no obvious apprenticeship behind it. This absence of precedent is precisely where the more speculative theories take root, not fringe claims that scholars regard as historically supported, but ideas that persist in popular imagination alongside the academic record, testament to how genuinely difficult the achievement is to explain in purely conventional terms. Some point to the age-old association, found in a handful of medieval legends across different cultures, between extraordinary construction feats and outside assistance, whether framed as divine intervention, as in the Ethiopian tradition itself, or reframed in modern retellings as evidence of lost technologies or techniques no longer understood today. Mainstream historians generally treat these later reinterpretations with considerable skepticism, noting that human ingenuity, sufficient labor, generational continuity, and enough time can account for extraordinary achievements without requiring an explanation beyond the historical record, and that the true chronology likely spans considerably more than 23 years, which alone resolves much of the apparent impossibility. But even by that more measured accounting, the churches of Lalibela remain a monumental achievement whose specific methods, workforce organization, and precise timeline were never recorded in enough contemporary detail to fully reconstruct. No inscriptions at the site name the laborers who carved it. No contemporary 12th or 13th century document survives describing the project's logistics, its workforce, or its true duration in the kind of granular detail that would settle the debate. What remains is the stone itself. 11 churches, sunk into the earth, carved with a precision historians still find difficult to fully explain, standing in a landscape that offers no obvious answer as to how, exactly, human hands alone accomplished what the local tradition still credits, in part, to hands that were not human at all. Whether the true story is one of accumulated generations of skilled labor working in careful phases, or something closer to the miraculous account preserved in Ethiopian tradition, the churches themselves keep their silence. Carved so deep into the rock that, even after 8 centuries, the ground has never given up exactly how it was done. Heat, dust, the clash of iron on iron, and somewhere beneath it, the low murmur of monks chanting even as the walls around them begin to fall. That is the sound this chapter opens on, the fall of Jerusalem in the year 1187, and the fate of a crown that, by most accounts, has never been seen since. Picture the treasury of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, housed within the royal palace near the Tower of David, in the final desperate weeks before Saladin's forces closed around the city. Here, according to chroniclers of the period, were kept the regalia of the Latin kings of Jerusalem: crowns, ceremonial swords, reliquaries, and vestments accumulated across nearly 90 years of Crusader rule, since Godfrey of Bouillon first took the city in 1099. Among these objects, medieval sources describe a crown of particular significance, used in the coronation of the kingdom's rulers, along with other regalia understood to carry deep symbolic weight for a Christian kingdom that considered itself the guardian of the holiest city in its faith. When Jerusalem fell to Saladin in October of 1187, following the catastrophic defeat of the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin, the fate of that treasury became one of the more curious loose threads in an otherwise well-documented conquest. The mainstream historical account is fairly straightforward as far as it goes. Saladin's terms for the surrender of Jerusalem were, by the standards of the age, notably lenient. Inhabitants were permitted to ransom themselves and depart with a portion of their possessions, rather than face the massacre that had accompanied the city's capture by the First Crusade nearly a century before. Many nobles, along with representatives of the military orders, are recorded as having left the city carrying whatever wealth and sacred objects they could transport, some bound for Tyre, which remained under Crusader control, others sailing onward to Europe entirely. It is reasonable enough to assume, as many historians do, that the royal regalia left with them, dispersed among the departing nobility and perhaps eventually absorbed into other treasuries, church collections, or private hands across Europe, its specific identity gradually lost as decades passed, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself faded into a title held in name only by increasingly distant claimants. And yet no crown identified with confidence as belonging to the kings of Jerusalem has ever surfaced in any European collection, church treasury, or royal inventory in the centuries since. This is not, on its own, especially strange. Medieval regalia was routinely melted down, remounted, or repurposed, its precious metals and stones stripped for reuse in later objects. A fate that likely befell a great many royal treasures, whose specific historical identity vanished along with their original form. Given the financial pressures on the surviving Crusader nobility, many of whom arrived in Europe as refugees with more urgent needs than preserving ceremonial objects intact, this mundane explanation accounts for a great deal. What it does not fully explain is the curious silence in the contemporary record regarding exactly what happened to the treasury in the days immediately surrounding the surrender itself. Chroniclers on both the Christian and Muslim sides, including Ibn al-Athir and other near-contemporary Arab historians, alongside Latin sources such as the continuator of William of Tyre, describe the terms of surrender, the ransom arrangements, and the general conduct of the transition in reasonable detail. Yet none offer a clear, specific account of the royal regalia's disposition. Did it leave with the patriarch Heraclius, who is recorded as having departed the city with considerable personal wealth, drawing sharp criticism from chroniclers who contrasted his comfortable exit with the far more desperate circumstances of poorer Christians unable to afford their own ransom? Was it divided among the military orders, whose surviving members withdrew to their remaining strongholds along the coast? Or did some portion of it remain within the city, absorbed into Saladin's own treasury as part of the spoils of conquest, its Christian symbolism stripped away or repurposed in ways that left no clear trace in the historical record available to us today? This gap has left room, inevitably, for theories that live well outside the mainstream consensus. Some later, considerably less reliable accounts, emerging centuries after the fact, often intertwined with the same broader Templar legends already explored in this history, have suggested that certain relics or regalia associated with the Kingdom of Jerusalem were deliberately hidden rather than transported, concealed somewhere within the city or its surroundings by clergy or knights unwilling to see them fall into Muslim hands, intending a recovery that circumstances never allowed. Serious historians treat these claims with real skepticism, noting the complete absence of any contemporary source supporting concealment, as opposed to conventional departure, and the strong tendency of later writers to graft treasure narratives onto almost any medieval institution whose ultimate fate is not perfectly documented. Still, the underlying uncertainty that gives such theories their foothold is genuine. Unlike many royal treasuries whose dispersal can be traced through subsequent inventories, sales, or church records, the regalia of the Kingdom of Jerusalem essentially disappears from the documentary record at precisely the moment it would have been most valuable to trace. What we are left with, then, is a well-documented conquest wrapped around an oddly undocumented object. A kingdom fell, its people ransomed themselves or fled, and its symbols of sovereignty, a crown, swords, sacred vestments accumulated across 90 years of rule, passed out of the historical record without any chronicler pausing to note precisely where they went. Perhaps they were melted down in some anonymous European workshop within a generation, their gold repurposed into objects that carry no trace of their origin. Or perhaps something was left behind in Jerusalem that October, tucked into a wall or a cistern by hands that never returned to retrieve it, waiting in the same soil that has already surrendered so many of the city's secrets and kept so many more. Tucked into a wall, waiting for hands that never returned. Let that image travel now from a fallen city to a cathedral floor, where another sacred fragment of the medieval world would vanish just as completely, though its disappearance would unfold not in the chaos of conquest, but in the calculated silence of a king 3 centuries later. Picture the nave of Canterbury Cathedral on the evening of December 29th, 1170. The stone floor slick with blood where Archbishop Thomas Becket had fallen only moments before, struck down by 4 knights of King Henry II who had crossed the channel believing, rightly or wrongly, that they were acting on their king's furious wish to be rid of a troublesome priest. Contemporary accounts, several written by clerics who knew Becket personally, describe the horror that swept through Christendom in the weeks that followed. A sitting archbishop murdered inside his own cathedral at the altar steps by men who had entered under arms. Within 3 years, Pope Alexander III had canonized Becket as a saint, and Canterbury rapidly became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in medieval Europe, a status it would hold for the better part of 4 centuries. What followed the murder is unusually well documented by medieval standards. Becket's body, according to eyewitness monastic accounts, was initially buried in the cathedral's crypt, and almost immediately, pilgrims began reporting miraculous cures attributed to contact with his blood and remains, accounts collected and recorded in remarkable detail by monks at Canterbury, who compiled hundreds of purported miracles within just a few years of his death. In 1220, 50 years after the murder, Becket's remains were formally translated to a magnificent new shrine within the cathedral, encased in a reliquary so richly adorned with gold and jewels that later accounts describe pilgrims struggling to look directly at it in the light. For over 3 centuries, that shrine stood as one of the great devotional sites of the medieval world, drawing pilgrims from across Europe, immortalized in works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, whose pilgrims are, after all, traveling toward exactly this shrine. Then, in 1538, it was gone. The verified history of what happened is clear enough in its broad strokes. King Henry VIII, in the midst of the English Reformation and his broader campaign against the authority and wealth of the Catholic Church, ordered the destruction of Becket's shrine specifically, a pointed act, given that Becket had become, across the centuries, a powerful symbol of clerical resistance to royal authority, precisely the kind of resistance Henry was determined to crush in his own reign. Royal commissioners arrived at Canterbury and dismantled the shrine, and contemporary accounts describe the gold, silver, and jewels being carted away, reportedly requiring several wagons to transport the treasure back to the royal coffers. Henry additionally ordered that Becket's name be struck from the calendar of saints, his images destroyed or defaced throughout England, and his very sainthood formally revoked by royal proclamation. An extraordinary act, given that only the Pope, in ordinary circumstances, held any authority to make or unmake a saint. But it is what happened to the bones themselves that has never been settled with anything like the same certainty. Official Tudor accounts, and later Protestant chroniclers writing with evident satisfaction, claimed that Becket's remains were burned, and the ashes scattered or fired from a cannon, a fittingly total destruction for a cult the Crown wished to erase entirely from English memory. This has long been treated as the most straightforward explanation, consistent with Henry's evident determination to eliminate not just the shrine's wealth, but its devotional power as a rallying point for opposition. Yet the evidence for this specific claim is thinner than the confidence with which it is sometimes repeated. No eyewitness account from someone present at the destruction describes the burning in verified detail. The story appears to rest largely on second-hand report and later Protestant polemic, sources with an obvious interest in emphasizing the totality of the saint's erasure. Complicating matters further, in 1888, workmen undertaking repairs in Canterbury Cathedral's crypt discovered a sealed tomb containing human remains in a location consistent with where Becket's body is recorded to have been placed during the original 1170 burial, before the 1220 translation to the famous shrine. The bones were examined, tentatively linked by some at the time to Becket himself, and then quietly resealed, without the kind of thorough forensic investigation that later centuries would demand of such a find. Were these truly Becket's original remains, perhaps only partially moved during the 1220 translation, leaving some portion behind in the crypt entirely by accident, and thus spared from Henry's commissioners 3 centuries later? Or were they the remains of some other cleric entirely, an unrelated burial that happened to share the same general location? The cathedral has never permitted the exhaustive scientific examination that might resolve the question conclusively, leaving the 1888 discovery as one of the more tantalizing, unresolved threads in the entire Becket story. Beyond the crypt itself, the broader dispersal of Becket relics compounds the uncertainty rather than resolving it. Before the 1538 destruction, fragments of Becket's bones, blood, and clothing had already been distributed as relics to churches and private collectors across Europe for over 3 centuries, a common practice for major medieval saints. Some of these fragments survive today in scattered collections, their authenticity impossible to verify with confidence given the centuries separating any given fragment from its claimed origin, and given how routinely relic collections were forged, misattributed, or simply lost track of over such a long span of time. Somewhere among these scattered fragments, genuine remnants of Becket may well persist, unrecognized, mixed among relics whose provenance was never reliably recorded even in their own era. so did Henry VIII's men truly reduce a canonized saint to ash and cannon fire, erasing him as completely as the Tudor chroniclers claimed? Or did some portion of Becket, in that sealed crypt tomb, or scattered among the relic collections of a dozen forgotten churches, survive the very destruction ordered to be total? Canterbury Cathedral still stands over the empty space where the great shrine once drew pilgrims by the thousands, its gold and jewels melted down centuries ago into forms no one could now trace. But whether the man himself was ever truly reduced to nothing, or whether some fragment of him still rests quietly beneath English soil, waiting for a certainty history has so far declined to offer, remains a question the cathedral's silent stones have never fully answered. 2 decades after Becket's blood dried on Canterbury's stones, another host of Christians marched east into the mountains of Anatolia. And there, in a matter of weeks, an army 40,000 strong seemed to simply come apart, leaving behind a set of chronicles that still cannot agree on exactly what happened to it. Picture the plain outside Nicaea in the autumn of 1147, tents stretching toward the horizon, banners marking the presence of Conrad III, King of the Romans, and beneath him a vast host of German Crusaders answering the call of the Second Crusade, preached across Europe by Bernard of Clairvaux, following the shocking loss of the county of Edessa to Muslim forces 2 years earlier. This was to be a triumphant continuation of the First Crusade's success half a century before. A second wave, larger and better organized, marching to secure what the first generation of Crusaders had won. Contemporary estimates, always uncertain for medieval armies, place Conrad's force at somewhere in the range of 20 to 40,000, a number that would have made it one of the largest single armies fielded in Europe in generations. They set out from Nicaea toward Antioch, following, broadly, the overland route the First Crusade had taken through Anatolia decades before. Within a matter of weeks, that army had all but ceased to exist as a fighting force. The verified history offers several intersecting explanations, none of which, on their own, fully accounts for the scale of the disaster. Byzantine sources, chief among them the historian and Princess Anna Komnenos' near-contemporary successors, along with the Latin chronicler Odo of Duil, who traveled with the separate French crusading army under Louis VII, describe a campaign undermined from its earliest days by logistics that simply could not sustain a force of this size, moving through unfamiliar, resource-poor terrain. Conrad's army, by most accounts, chose to bypass the safer coastal route in favor of a more direct path through the Anatolian interior, likely to save time, but in doing so exposed themselves to country with little food, scarce water, and hostile Seljuk Turkish forces who knew the terrain intimately and who had no intention of allowing an easy passage for a Christian army marching toward territories the Seljuks themselves contested. Near Dorylaeum, a site already infamous from the First Crusade's own battle there decades earlier, Conrad's forces were ambushed, harassed, and gradually worn down by Seljuk cavalry employing hit-and-run tactics that the heavily armored German knights, better suited to open pitched battle, struggled to counter. Chroniclers describe a retreat that quickly became a rout, with stragglers picked off, supply lines severed, and increasing numbers of soldiers succumbing to starvation and exhaustion rather than direct combat. Odo of Duy, writing from the perspective of the separate French contingent that encountered Conrad's shattered remnants soon after, describes scenes of considerable disorder, though how much of his account reflects careful eyewitness reporting versus the kind of moralizing exaggeration common to medieval chronicle writing is difficult to fully untangle at this remove. What is more difficult to resolve is the matter of the Byzantine guides. Several chronicles, including Odo's, imply, with varying degrees of directness, that local guides supplied by the Byzantine Empire, nominally an ally of the Crusade, may have led Conrad's forces along routes poorly suited to sustaining so large an army, whether through simple incompetence, unfamiliarity with conditions along that particular path, or something closer to deliberate misdirection. Byzantine Crusader relations during this period were notoriously strained. The Byzantines had their own complicated diplomatic relationship with the Seljuks, and considerable reason to be wary of a massive foreign army marching through their territory. Mainstream historians generally favor incompetence, logistical strain, and the simple brutality of the terrain over deliberate betrayal as the primary explanation, noting that Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos had genuine strategic reasons to want the crusade to succeed, at least in some limited form, given his own interest in the region. But the ambiguity in the sources themselves has never been fully resolved, and the possibility of at least some degree of Byzantine indifference, or worse, toward the German army's fate continues to be debated among historians of the period. What ultimately remains unclear, more than logistics or possible betrayal, is the precise scale and manner of the army's dissolution. No single chronicle offers a reliable tally of how many of Conrad's original force died in the mountains near Dorylaeum, how many deserted or scattered into the surrounding countryside, and how many eventually straggled onward to rejoin what remained of the crusading effort further east. Estimates of losses vary enormously across different sources, some implying the army was reduced to a small fraction of its original strength within weeks, others suggesting a somewhat less total collapse. Given the near-total absence of surviving muster rolls, supply records, or systematic Byzantine or German administrative documentation from the campaign itself, historians are left largely dependent on chronicle accounts written by observers with their own biases, their own limited vantage points, and their own reasons to shape the narrative toward blame, tragedy, or divine judgment rather than precise record-keeping. Did Byzantine guides, whether through negligence or quiet calculation, lead tens of thousands of men into terrain that could never have sustained them? Did the unforgiving geography of Anatolia alone account for losses that chroniclers, writing after the fact and piecing together second-hand reports, could never fully quantify? Or does the truth lie somewhere in the wide, undocumented space between those two explanations, in the fate of individual soldiers who simply vanished from the historical record the moment they fell behind the retreating column, their names and numbers never recorded by anyone who survived long enough to write them down? The mountains near Dorylaeum have never given up a clear accounting of exactly how many men entered them, and exactly how few walked back out. It is Berold, the butcher of Rouen, we return to now, the one man pulled alive from the wreck of the White Ship, whose testimony is nearly all that survives to tell us what happened to the young man he watched drown that night. William Adelin, heir to the throne of England, and the one death among nearly 300 whose loss would reshape a kingdom. Picture the water off Barfleur in the hour after midnight on November 25, 1120, black and freezing, littered with wreckage and the cries of the dying. Somewhere in that chaos, according to the small handful of medieval chronicles that address the wreck in any detail, William Adelin, 17-year-old son of King Henry III of England and Duke of Normandy, had very nearly escaped. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts, most notably that of the Anglo-Norman historian Orderic Vitalis, writing within a couple of decades of the event, and drawing at least in part on testimony traceable back to Berold himself, describe William being placed into a small ship's boat, a maneuver that should have carried him safely to shore while the White Ship broke apart behind him. It is what happened next that has never been fully settled, resting as it does on a chain of second-hand report reaching back to a single, traumatized survivor recounting, likely under considerable emotional strain, events he witnessed from the water in freezing darkness. According to the account most widely repeated by medieval chroniclers, William, safely aboard the small boat and moving away from danger, heard the cries of his half-sister, the Countess of Perche, still trapped on the sinking ship, and ordered the boat turned back to attempt her rescue. In the chaos that followed, other desperate survivors in the water swarmed the returning boat, attempting to climb aboard, and it capsized under their combined weight, drowning William along with everyone else who had reached it. It is, on its face, a story with an unmistakably moral shape. A young prince, offered the chance to save himself, choosing instead to risk everything for his sister, and paying for that choice with his life. Whether that shape reflects what genuinely happened, or reflects the tendency of medieval chroniclers to impose meaning and moral instruction onto chaotic, poorly witnessed events, is a question historians have never been able to resolve with confidence. There is reason for both trust and caution here. Orderic Vitalis was a careful historian by the standards of his era, and his account does appear to draw, at some remove, on testimony from Berold, who would have had at least partial visibility of events near the wreck during the hours he clung to a spar awaiting rescue. But Berold's own vantage point was necessarily limited. A man in freezing water, in darkness, focused on his own survival, watching events unfold at some distance and under conditions that would challenge any witness's ability to accurately perceive and later recall precise sequences of cause and effect. The specific detail of William's boat turning back for his sister may be substantially accurate. It may also be an embellishment, added consciously or unconsciously somewhere along the chain of retelling between that November night and the moment Orderic committed the story to parchment, years or decades later. What deepens the uncertainty further is the complete absence of any competing account from someone with a different vantage point. No other named survivor of the wreck exists in the historical record. No official inquiry, in the modern sense, was conducted into the specific sequence of events aboard the ship in its final minutes, a striking gap given that this was, in essence, the death of the heir to the English throne, an event with enormous political consequences that one might expect to have generated more careful contemporary documentation. Instead, what we have is a single narrative thread, passed through a single traumatized witness, recorded by a single historian working at some remove from the event itself, with no independent corroboration available to test it against. This gap has left room for other, more speculative questions to surface over the centuries, questions mainstream historians generally treat with real caution, but that persist nonetheless in popular retellings of the disaster. Was the ship's captain, Thomas Fitzstephen, truly as reckless and drunk as the chronicles imply, or might the wreck have resulted from some other cause? A navigational error made under entirely sober conditions, given how well known the Killabooth Rock was said to be to local sailors, raising the uncomfortable possibility that competent seamen made a catastrophic mistake, for reasons the sources simply never explain. Did political tensions within Henry's court, or rivalries among the Anglo-Norman nobility traveling aboard the ship that night, play any role in decisions made in the ship's final, chaotic minutes? Decisions that might have differed had cooler heads and clearer hierarchies prevailed? No evidence supports these possibilities beyond speculation, and most historians regard them as exactly that. But the thinness of the primary record is real, and it is precisely that thinness which allows such questions to persist rather than being definitively closed. William Adelin's body, like most of those lost that night, was never recovered. No contemporary account describes a search for his remains with any specificity, and the wreck itself has never been conclusively located on the floor of the English Channel. What remains in the end is a single chronicler's account of a single survivor's memory of a single tragic decision made in darkness and cold. A story compelling enough to have shaped how an entire kingdom's succession crisis was understood for 9 centuries, and fragile enough that no one can say with real certainty whether it happened exactly as told, or whether the truth of William Adelin's final minutes went down with him into the Blackwater off Barfleur, and has never surfaced since. Some 500 miles northeast of that black stretch of channel water, along a different coastline entirely, another kind of survival was quietly running out its final centuries. Not a single dynasty, but an entire religious world, clinging to the last untouched corners of northern Europe long after the rest of the continent had turned to Christ. Picture the sacred grove at Romuva, somewhere in the forests of medieval Lithuania, a site described by several chroniclers as the ceremonial heart of the last openly pagan realm in Europe, presided over by a figure known as the Krevis, a high priest whose authority reportedly extended across the pagan Baltic world. No physical structure survives to mark its exact location today, and its precise site remains debated among historians and archaeologists, a fitting uncertainty for a religious tradition that left behind remarkably little in the way of durable temples or monumental architecture, favoring instead sacred groves, eternal fires, and oral tradition passed down through priestly lineages rather than written scripture. By the time most of Europe had been Christian for the better part of a millennium, Lithuania remained defiantly, officially pagan, the last state on the continent to hold out against conversion, a distinction it carried until as late as 1387, and even then, historians widely agree that genuine popular conversion in the countryside lagged the official royal baptism by generations. The broad historical outline here is well established. The Baltic region, encompassing the ancestors of modern Lithuanians, Latvians, and the Old Prussians, had faced centuries of pressure to convert, driven first by Christian missionary efforts, and then, with increasing violence from the 12th century onward, by military campaigns collectively remembered as the Northern Crusades. Orders such as the Teutonic Knights and the Livonian Brothers of the Sword waged prolonged, brutal warfare against pagan Baltic peoples, framing conquest and conversion as inseparable goals sanctioned directly by the papacy. The Old Prussians were largely conquered, converted, and eventually assimilated or displaced by the 14th century. Yet Lithuania, despite centuries of nearly continuous warfare against these same crusading orders, not only survived as a pagan state, but grew under rulers like Gediminas and later Grand Duke Jogaila into one of the largest polities in Europe, its territory stretching deep into what is now Belarus and Ukraine. A pagan empire, improbably, thriving in the heart of Christian Europe centuries after paganism had been extinguished almost everywhere else on the continent. Why did Lithuania resist so successfully, for so long, when neighboring pagan peoples fell so much sooner? Historians point to a combination of factors that, taken together, offer a reasonably solid explanation. Lithuania's dense forests and extensive wetlands made large-scale crusading campaigns logistically punishing, denying invading armies the kind of decisive battlefield engagements that might have broken Lithuanian resistance quickly. Lithuanian rulers also proved remarkably adept at using diplomacy and selective strategic engagement with Christian powers, including periodic, politically convenient royal conversions that were later abandoned once immediate military pressure eased, to buy time, divide potential enemies, and maintain their pagan religious and political system intact, even while surrounded on nearly all sides by increasingly hostile Christian neighbors. When Grand Duke Jogaila finally accepted baptism in 1386 as part of a dynastic union with the Kingdom of Poland, it was, by most historical accounts, a calculated political decision rather than a spiritual conversion born of long-building religious pressure, securing an alliance and a crown rather than answering a call of conscience. What is considerably harder to trace with the same confidence is how long genuine pagan practice and belief persisted beneath the surface of official conversion, particularly in the countryside far from royal courts and newly built churches. Missionary reports and church records from the 15th and even 16th centuries continue to describe rural populations maintaining sacred groves, venerating eternal fires, and practicing customs that church authorities repeatedly condemned as lingering paganism, sometimes more than a century after the official date of conversion. Some ethnographers and folklorists have argued that certain rural customs, seasonal festivals, and folk beliefs recorded in Lithuania as late as the 19th century preserve genuine, if heavily transformed, continuities with pre-Christian religious practice. Evidence, if accurate, that formal Christianization was in some sense a surface phenomenon layered over a much longer, quieter continuity of older belief that official church records never fully captured or suppressed. This uncertainty has, inevitably, invited theories that reach further than the documentary record can fully support. Some later writers and, more recently, adherents of modern pagan revival movements have argued that organized pagan religious practice, complete with functioning priestly hierarchies, survived in isolated pockets of the Baltic and Slavic countryside considerably longer than mainstream historians generally accept, persisting in remote villages largely beyond the reach of church authority well into the early modern period, and leaving behind ritual sites whose original purpose and precise dating remain genuinely contested. Mainstream historians and archaeologists remain cautious about such claims, noting the difficulty of clearly distinguishing authentic surviving pagan ritual from later folk custom that merely resembles it, reshaped over generations by storytellers and communities who no longer fully understood what they were preserving, if indeed they were preserving anything at all. Still, the underlying archaeological puzzle is genuine. Sacred sites across the Baltic region continue to be identified, excavated, and dated, and some yield evidence of ritual activity that specialists struggle to place with confidence on either side of the official conversion boundary. What remains, in the end, is a religious world that left behind no scripture, no permanent temples, and remarkably few written records of its own voice, known to us almost entirely through the accounts of the missionaries and Crusaders who sought to destroy it. Somewhere beneath the forests and wetlands of the Baltic, sacred groves once stood whose locations are now lost, tended by priests whose names went largely unrecorded, practicing rites that persisted, in some quiet and imperfectly documented form, long after the rest of Europe assumed paganism had been extinguished. Whether that persistence ended cleanly with the official conversions of the 14th century, or continued to flicker in isolated corners of the countryside for generations afterward, is a question the forests themselves have never fully answered. Sacred groves, whose locations are now lost, tended by builders whose names went unrecorded, that same erasure, that same silence surrounding a monumental achievement, waits for us again. This time carved not from timber and forest but from solid granite, rising from the hills of southern Africa. Picture the hill complex at Great Zimbabwe at dawn, when the granite boulders that crown it still hold the blue-gray shadow of night, while the valley below catches the first light. From this height, the eye follows a descent of stone terraces down toward the great enclosure, whose outer wall curves for some 250 meters, rising in places to over 11 meters high, built entirely of shaped granite blocks stacked without mortar, fitted with a precision that is held for the better part of 1,000 years without binding agent of any kind. Within that outer wall stands the conical tower, a solid, purpose-built structure roughly 10 meters tall, its function still debated, its silhouette unmistakable against the enclosure's curved walls. This is the largest stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa built before the modern era, and for a site of such scale and sophistication, it has spent an unusually long and troubled history having its true origins denied, disputed, and only gradually restored to the people whose ancestors actually built it. The verified archaeological record, established through decades of careful excavation, radiocarbon dating, and comparative study, is now reasonably clear on the essential facts, even where specific details remain contested. Great Zimbabwe was constructed and occupied primarily between the 11th and 15th centuries AD, built by ancestors of the Shona people, and functioned as the capital of a substantial kingdom whose wealth derived significantly from control of regional trade networks, particularly in gold, ivory, and cattle, connecting the interior of southern Africa to Indian Ocean trade routes that carried goods as far as China and the Persian Gulf. Excavations at the site have recovered imported Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery, and glass beads from as far away as India, confirming that Great Zimbabwe's rulers were participants in a genuinely global medieval trade network. Their wealth built on gold extracted from regional mines and cattle herds that would have required a sophisticated, stable political and economic system to manage at this scale. At its height, estimates suggest the settlement may have housed somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers in the region during this period. None of this, notably, required any explanation beyond the considerable skill, organization, and accumulated wealth of the Shona kingdoms themselves. And yet, for well over a century after European explorers and colonial administrators first extensively documented the site in the late 19th century, that straightforward explanation was, with striking persistence, rejected. This is where the history of Great Zimbabwe becomes genuinely strange, not because the archaeological evidence is ambiguous, but because of how thoroughly that evidence was ignored, distorted, or actively suppressed for political reasons that had nothing to do with archaeology itself. When European colonial explorers and administrators encountered the ruins in the 1870s and 1880s, many refused to accept that African societies could have built something of this scale and sophistication, and instead advanced a series of theories attributing the site to foreign builders entirely. Some proposed it was the work of Phoenician traders. Others suggested a connection to the biblical Queen of Sheba, or speculated about lost Egyptian, Arab, or even Portuguese origins predating confirmed European contact with the region. These theories were not fringe curiosities confined to popular imagination. They were actively promoted by colonial authorities, including figures connected to Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company, which controlled the territory then known as Rhodesia, and had a direct political interest in denying that indigenous African societies were capable of building monumental architecture, since such an admission complicated the ideological justifications colonial powers relied on to legitimize their rule. By the early 20th century, professional archaeologists conducting careful excavations at the site, including David Randall McIver in 1905 and later Gertrude Caton Thompson in the 1920s, had already established through stratigraphy, artifact analysis, and comparison with other regional sites that Great Zimbabwe was unambiguously of African origin and medieval in date, built by the ancestors of the local Shona population. Caton Thompson's 1929 report was unequivocal on this point, based on rigorous archaeological method rather than speculation. And yet, the colonial government of Rhodesia continued, for decades afterward, to suppress this conclusion in official publications, museum displays, and educational materials, insisting on foreign origin theories well into the 1960s and 1970s for reasons that were transparently political rather than scientific. An extraordinary case of archaeological consensus being actively overruled by state authority for the better part of half a century after the actual evidence had already settled the question. It was only after Zimbabwean independence in 1980 that the site's true history was fully and officially restored in the country's own institutions, the new nation taking its very name from the ruins whose African origins had been denied for so long by the colonial regime that preceded it. that history alone, a monument whose builders were known to specialists but denied by governments for political convenience, would be a remarkable enough story on its own. But even with the question of who built Great Zimbabwe, now firmly and correctly settled among historians and archaeologists, genuine questions about the details of its construction, its social organization, and its eventual decline remain considerably less resolved. Chief among them is the question of precisely how the labor and engineering of the site were organized. The dry stone construction technique used throughout Great Zimbabwe, shaping granite blocks and stacking them without mortar in walls that have withstood centuries of weather, required considerable skill and almost certainly a specialized class of builders. Yet no contemporary written record from the builders themselves survives to describe how that labor force was organized, trained, or compensated, since Shona oral tradition and the broader Bantu language societies of the region did not rely on the kind of written administrative record-keeping that might otherwise have preserved such details. What we know instead comes almost entirely from the archaeological remains themselves, and from oral traditions recorded centuries after the site's peak, traditions that offer valuable cultural context, but that historians must treat carefully, given how much can shift and blur across generations of retelling before being finally written down by outside observers. There is also the unresolved question of why Great Zimbabwe was ultimately abandoned, sometime in the 15th century, after roughly 3 centuries as the political and economic center of a major regional kingdom. The most widely supported explanations point to environmental strain. A population of the size estimated for Great Zimbabwe would have placed considerable pressure on surrounding agricultural land, grazing, and fuel resources. And some researchers have proposed that soil depletion, deforestation, or a shift in regional climate patterns may have made the site increasingly difficult to sustain at its former scale. Others point to shifting trade routes, suggesting that as gold and ivory trade networks reoriented toward other regional centers, Great Zimbabwe's economic foundations gradually eroded, prompting political power to shift elsewhere, eventually giving rise to successor states such as the Kingdom of Mutapa further north. Both explanations are plausible and not mutually exclusive, and most historians accept some combination of environmental and economic pressures as the likely cause. But the precise sequence and timeline of the decline remains difficult to reconstruct with full confidence, given the limits of the archaeological and oral historical record for this specific transition period. Beyond these more grounded scholarly debates, the long shadow of the old foreign origin theories has left behind a curious afterlife in popular and fringe literature, where claims about Phoenician, biblical, or otherwise non-African builders continue to circulate in certain corners of alternative history writing and popular media, entirely disconnected from and contradicted by the archaeological consensus that has stood firm for nearly a century. Professional archaeologists and historians treat these persistent claims as thoroughly discredited, a legacy of colonial-era political bias rather than any genuine ambiguity in the evidence. Still, their persistence in popular imagination, decades after the archaeological question was definitively settled, says something notable in its own right about how difficult it can be to fully dislodge a false narrative once it has been repeated often enough, even after the specialists who study the evidence most closely have long since moved on to other, more substantive questions about the site. What remains certain is this: Great Zimbabwe stands as an unambiguous testament to the sophistication of the Shona kingdoms that built it, a monument whose true origins were known to careful investigators within decades of its rediscovery by outsiders, yet were nonetheless denied by those in power for the better part of a century afterward. The genuine mysteries that remain are not about who built it, but about the finer details of daily life within its walls, the specific organization of the labor that raised its towering enclosures, and the exact sequence of pressures that eventually emptied a city that had once housed thousands. Somewhere within the stones of the great enclosure, and beneath the soil the site still guards, further answers to those quieter, more specific questions likely wait to be uncovered. Not questions about whether Africans could build monuments of this scale, a question history has already and definitively answered, but questions about the precise human lives, decisions, and pressures that shaped one of the great cities of the medieval world, and about what unexplored fraction of its long history still remains buried beneath ground that has already given up so much and kept just as much back. Ground that has already given up so much and kept just as much back. Let us return to that same ground now, but climb higher, to the hill above the great enclosure, where the very earliest builders of Great Zimbabwe raised their first stone walls, and then, generations before the rest of the city was ever abandoned, quietly walked away from them. Picture the hill complex at Great Zimbabwe, the oldest and highest section of the entire settlement, its granite walls threading between natural boulders that were incorporated directly into the architecture rather than cleared away, as though the earliest builders saw the rock formations themselves as sacred and worked around them out of reverence rather than convenience. Archaeological dating places the earliest occupation and construction here in the 11th century AD, centuries before the great enclosure below was built at the height of the kingdom's power in the 13th and 14th centuries. For generations, the hill complex functioned as the political and likely spiritual center of the settlement, the residence of its earliest rulers, the highest and most defensible point in the entire complex, deliberately separated from the lower town by both elevation and a network of walls that controlled access with evident care. And yet archaeological evidence indicates that significant portions of this earliest elite area were abandoned, or at least substantially reduced in use, well before the wider city itself went into its eventual 15th century decline. A much earlier and more localized withdrawal that has never been as fully explained as the broader story of the site's later abandonment. The verified archaeological record here rests on careful stratigraphic work, much of it building on Gertrude Caton Thompson's foundational 1929 excavations, and refined considerably by later 20th and 21st century archaeologists using improved dating techniques. Excavations at the hill complex reveal distinct occupation layers, with evidence suggesting that the character and intensity of activity there shifted markedly over the site's history. Some archaeologists have proposed that political and ceremonial authority gradually relocated from the hill complex down to the great enclosure as the kingdom's population and wealth expanded, a reasonably intuitive explanation given that the great enclosure's construction and peak use appeared to post-date the hill complex's own primary elite occupation by a meaningful span of time. Under this view, the hill complex was not so much abandoned in any dramatic sense as gradually superseded, its original elite function migrating to newer, larger, more centrally located architecture, better suited to a growing kingdom's administrative and ceremonial needs, while the older hilltop site persisted in some reduced or altered capacity, perhaps retaining religious significance even after its political importance had waned. This explanation accounts for a great deal, and most historians treat it as the leading interpretation. Growing kingdoms do commonly relocate their centers of power as circumstances change, and there is nothing inherently mysterious about a capital's political heart-shifting location over the course of several centuries of continuous habitation. But the specific archaeological details at the hill complex leave some questions considerably less settled than this smooth narrative of gradual transition would suggest. Several archaeologists working at the site have noted that certain sections of the hill complex show evidence of what appears to be a more abrupt cessation of elite activity, rather than the slow, continuous decline one might expect from a purely gradual shift in political center. Artifact deposits in some areas suggest occupation ending within a comparatively narrow window rather than tapering off across generations, and some structures show signs of having been deliberately closed off or sealed rather than simply falling into disuse through gradual neglect. Why would a ruling elite deliberately seal portions of their oldest ceremonial and residential complex, rather than simply allowing it to fade in importance as attention shifted elsewhere? Was this an act of ritual closure, consistent with practices documented in other Bantu-speaking societies in the region where significant structures or sites were sometimes deliberately decommissioned through ceremony when their intended purpose had been fulfilled, or their spiritual power was believed to have been exhausted? Or does it suggest something more disruptive occurred? A succession crisis, a shift in ruling lineage, or some other internal political rupture significant enough to prompt a more decisive break with the previous seat of power, rather than the smooth continuous transition that the simplest reading of the evidence might otherwise imply? Oral traditions collected among Shona communities in more recent centuries offer some possible context here, though historians rightly treat such traditions with appropriate caution given the centuries of retelling, separating them from the events they describe. Some traditions reference successions of rulers and periods of conflict or realignment associated with sacred sites, patterns broadly consistent with the idea that shifts in ritual and political geography at Great Zimbabwe may have been tied to specific dynastic transitions rather than purely gradual demographic or economic drift. But no oral tradition specifically and reliably identifies the particular transition visible in the hill complex's archaeological record, leaving historians to draw inference rather than confirmation from this material. There is also the intriguing detail of certain artifacts recovered from the hill complex, including the famous soapstone birds now recognized as among Great Zimbabwe's most significant surviving symbols, several of which were found specifically within this earliest elite area. Their precise original function and symbolic meaning remain genuinely debated among specialists, generally understood as representations connected to spiritual or royal authority, quite possibly linked to ancestral or divine symbolism associated with the ruling lineage, though the specific belief system they once expressed was never recorded in contemporary written form, and must be reconstructed carefully from archaeological context and later ethnographic comparison. If the hill complex's abandonment was indeed tied to some significant shift in dynastic or spiritual authority, the eventual removal, burial, or deliberate positioning of these carved birds within the site takes on an added layer of significance that archaeologists continue to study, without yet reaching full consensus on precisely what these objects meant to the people who placed them there, or why some appeared to have been left behind when the area's broader elite function diminished. Compounding the uncertainty further is the question of environmental pressure at this specific, earlier stage of the settlement's history, separate from the broader environmental strain that likely contributed to the city's much later 15th century decline. Some researchers have proposed that the hill complex's naturally restricted space, hemmed in by granite outcrops and defensible terrain that made it valuable in the settlement's earliest and more vulnerable years, may have become a genuine, practical limitation as the ruling elite's household, retinue, and ceremonial requirements grew beyond what the hilltop site could comfortably accommodate, prompting a relatively swift relocation. Once a viable alternative, the great enclosure below became feasible to construct. This explanation, grounded in practical spatial constraints rather than political rupture, remains entirely plausible and is not necessarily incompatible with a more abrupt archaeological transition, since a decision to relocate an entire elite establishment once made could plausibly be executed within a relatively narrow window of time, even if the underlying pressures had been building more gradually beforehand. What emerges from all of this is a genuine, still open scholarly question, sitting quietly within a site whose broader history has, in most other respects, been solidly established. Unlike the earlier, thoroughly resolved question of who built Great Zimbabwe, the specific circumstances surrounding the hill, Complex's early and comparatively abrupt reduction in elite use, remain the subject of ongoing archaeological investigation and reasonable scholarly disagreement, without the kind of politically motivated distortion that clouded the site's broader origin story for so long. This is simply an authentic gap in the evidence, the product of a society that recorded its own history through architecture, oral tradition, and material culture rather than written chronicle, leaving modern researchers to reconstruct motive and sequence from stone, soil, and the objects left behind in both. Was the shift from the hill complex to the great enclosure a smooth, generations-long transfer of power, or did it mark a sharper break, a moment when something happened at the summit of Great Zimbabwe significant enough to prompt its rulers to seal parts of their oldest sanctuary and move decisively elsewhere? The soapstone birds recovered from the hill still watch over that unresolved question from museum collections and replica displays across Zimbabwe today, carved by hands whose specific reasons for placing them where they did were never written down. Somewhere in the layered soil of that hilltop, beneath walls built around boulders their builders considered too sacred to remove, the precise moment and true cause of that early abandonment likely still waits, as so much at Great Zimbabwe has waited before, for the ground to finally be asked the right question. Some 4,000 miles north and east of that granite hilltop, in a city built not of dry stacked stone but of marble, mosaic, and the accumulated weight of Roman imperial memory, another transition of power was unfolding in the shadowed rooms of a palace, one documented in extraordinary, almost claustrophobic detail by an eyewitness, and yet still shadowed by questions its author may have had every reason to leave unanswered. Picture the Mangana Palace complex in Constantinople in the early autumn of 1118, along the shore of the Bosphorus, where the Byzantine Emperor Alexios III Komnenos lay dying after a reign of 37 years, one of the longest and most consequential of the entire Byzantine era, a reign that had begun with the empire teetering on collapse following catastrophic losses to the Seljuk Turks, and ended with Byzantine power meaningfully restored, its borders stabilized, and its relationship with the crusading states of the Levant, however fraught, at least established on some workable footing. We know an unusual amount about Alexios's final days, because his own daughter, Anna Komnena, chronicled them in remarkable, almost unbearably intimate detail in her great historical work, the Alexiad, composed decades later. It is one of the most detailed deathbed accounts to survive from the medieval world, written by someone who was, by her own account, physically present in the room. And it is precisely because we have so much detail that certain gaps and silences within it stand out so clearly. The verified outline of Alexios's death is not, in the broadest sense, mysterious at all. Anna Komnene describes her father suffering for months from severe asthma and a debilitating swelling in his limbs, likely some form of edema, conditions that modern historians of medicine generally accept as consistent with genuine, non-suspicious chronic illness in an aging man who had spent decades in the physical exertions of near-constant military campaigning. Byzantine physicians attended him throughout his final illness, and Anna's account describes their various treatments and her own close involvement in his care, presenting the death, at its core, as the natural conclusion of a long physical decline rather than anything sudden or violent. On this fundamental point, historians see little reason for doubt. Alexios died of illness, in his bed, surrounded by family, at a reasonably advanced age for the period. There is no serious scholarly case for poisoning, assassination, or any other form of foul play in the emperor's own death. Where the genuine uncertainty begins is not in how Alexios died, but in what happened in the room around him as he did. specifically in the tangled, contested question of exactly how the succession was decided and whether the account Anna Komnene left us reflects the full truth of her own role in those final hours, or something considerably more selective. By most historical reconstructions, the succession should have been reasonably settled well before Alexios's final illness. His son, John II Komnenos, had already been crowned co-emperor years earlier, a standard Byzantine practice intended to secure a smooth transition of power and avoid exactly the kind of succession crisis that had destabilized the empire in the century before Alexios's own rise. And yet Anna Komnene's own account, along with other Byzantine sources, describes a deathbed atmosphere thick with tension, competing influence, and, depending on which details one weighs most heavily, the distinct possibility that Alexios's wife, the Empress Irene Doukaina, along with Anna herself, may have attempted, in those final hours, to have the succession redirected away from John and toward Anna's own husband, the historian and general, Nikephoros Bryennios. This is where the documentary record becomes genuinely difficult to fully untangle, not because evidence is scarce, but because so much of it comes from a single, deeply interested party. Anna Komnene's Alexiad remains our richest primary source for these events, yet Anna was, by multiple contemporary and later Byzantine accounts, an active participant in the succession dispute herself, someone with a personal stake in how the story of her father's final hours and her own conduct within them would be remembered by history. She was, after all, writing decades after her own bid to see her husband placed on the throne had failed, her brother John having secured the throne and reigned successfully for a quarter-century afterward, while Anna herself was, according to several later Byzantine sources, eventually implicated in an unsuccessful plot against John's life and rule, resulting in her effective political exile to a monastery, where she would spend her remaining decades, and where she wrote the very history that describes her father's death. Given this, how much can we trust Anna's own framing of what happened in that room? Her account describes John taking, or being given, their father's signet ring during his final moments, a detail loaded with symbolic significance in Byzantine political culture, since possession of the imperial ring carried real weight as a marker of legitimate succession. But Anna's description of exactly how John came to possess that ring, and whether Alexios himself, in his final lucid moments, genuinely willed the succession to proceed in John's favor, or whether John and his supporters acted with unusual haste and a degree of calculation to seize the moment before Irene and Anna's faction could act on their own preferred arrangement, remains genuinely contested among Byzantine historians studying the sources available to us. Some historians read Anna's account, despite her later political defeat, as broadly reliable on the mechanics of what happened, simply framed sympathetically toward her own conduct and interests. Others suggest her narrative, written so long after the fact by someone who had lost the very power struggle she was describing, likely smooths over or reshapes certain details in ways that cannot now be fully corrected or verified against any comparably detailed alternative account, since no other eyewitness left behind a narrative of comparable length or intimacy. What deepens the puzzle further is the question of Alexios's own true wishes in his final hours, a question that sits at the very center of the succession dispute, and that no source, including Anna's own extensive account, resolves with full confidence. Was John's swift assumption of full imperial authority immediately following his father's death an act that carried out Alexios's genuine, final intentions, perhaps communicated privately and decisively, in a way that Anna's account, shaped by her own subsequent defeat, chooses not to dwell on or fully credit? Or did John, sensing the political vulnerability of the moment, act with calculated speed to secure the throne before his mother and sister's competing preference for Nikephoros Bryennios could be formalized, regardless of what Alexios himself, in his weakened and possibly compromised final state, may have actually wanted. Byzantine chroniclers writing in the generations after these events offer some corroborating detail, generally supportive of John's version of events, though these later sources were themselves writing under the rule of John's own successors, within a dynasty that had every institutional interest in presenting John's accession as legitimate and uncontested from its very first hour. This is, in the end, a mystery of a distinctly different character than many others in this history. Not a vanished body, not an unrecovered treasure, not an unexplained physical structure, but a question buried within the competing motivations of the very people who left us our richest testimony about it. Alexios, or Komnenos himself, died, by every reasonable historical assessment, an entirely natural death, the product of long illness honestly and carefully documented by a daughter who loved him and was present at his side. But precisely what passed between mother, daughter, and son in that final chamber, whose hand truly guided the ring into John's possession, and whether it represented Alexios's genuine final will or a decisive act of political opportunism executed in the narrow window between his last breath and the empire's need for a settled successor, is a question that history has been left to answer, using only the words of the very people who had the most reason to shape how it would be remembered. Anna Komnene spent the rest of her long life in a monastery, writing the history of an empire and a father she loved, and of a succession she herself had fought to redirect and lost. Whether the version of events she left behind reflects the full truth of that chamber, or a carefully arranged memory shaped by decades of quiet reflection on her own defeat, is something the Alexiad itself, for all its extraordinary detail, was perhaps never going to tell us with complete honesty. And the palace where it all occurred, like so much of Byzantine Constantinople, has left us no other voice from that room to ask. 7 years before Alexios Komnenos would take his final breath in that Constantinople palace, a much older empire to the east had already been extinguished. Not in a single dramatic collapse, but through a slow, decades-long unraveling, whose precise mechanics historians are still working to fully untangle. Picture the ruins of Ghaznavid in what is now eastern Afghanistan, where 2 towering minarets still rise from the dust, slender, intricately decorated structures of baked brick, roughly 20 meters of their original height surviving today, remnants of what was once a far larger complex of palaces, mosques, and gardens, built to rival the great capitals of the Islamic world. This was the seat of the Ghaznavid Empire, founded in 977 by Sebuktigin, and expanded dramatically under his son, Mahmud of Ghazni, whose military campaign stretched the empire's reach from central Iran deep into the Indian subcontinent, and whose court became renowned across the medieval Islamic world as a center of scholarship and culture, patronizing figures such as the historian al-Biruni and the poet Ferdowsi, author of the Persian national epic, the Shahnameh. At its height in the early 11th century, the Ghaznavid Empire was one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world, its wealth drawn substantially from repeated, highly profitable military campaigns into northern India. And yet within roughly a century and a half of Mahmud's death, that empire had been reduced to a fraction of its former territory, its capital eventually sacked so thoroughly that later chroniclers describe the destruction in almost apocalyptic terms. The broad historical narrative of the Ghaznavid decline is reasonably well documented, at least in outline, thanks to a relatively rich tradition of contemporary and near-contemporary Persian and Arabic historical writing, including chroniclers such as Baihaqi, whose detailed history of the Ghaznavid court remains one of the great works of medieval Persian historiography. Following Mahmud's death in 1030, the empire passed to his son Mas'ud I, whose reign was troubled almost from the outset by administrative strain, court rivalries, and mounting military pressure from a rising power to the northwest. the Seljuk Turks, a formerly subordinate group of Turkic tribes who had migrated into Ghaznavid-controlled territory and gradually built up their own independent military strength. In 1040, at the Battle of Dandanakan, Seljuk forces decisively defeated the Ghaznavid army, a defeat from which the empire's core territories in Khorasan and Greater Iran never fully recovered. The battle is generally treated by historians as the single clearest turning point in the empire's fortunes, the moment when Ghaznavid dominance over its western territories effectively ended. Even though the dynasty itself would persist for another century and a half, its power increasingly concentrated in its eastern territories centered on Ghazni and, eventually, Lahore. This much is solid, well-supported history. What becomes considerably more difficult to pin down with confidence is the deeper question of why an empire that had seemed so formidable under Mahmud proved unable to withstand the Seljuk challenge so comprehensively, and why its subsequent century and a half of reduced existence was marked by such persistent internal instability, court intrigue, and repeated succession crises that seem, on close examination, disproportionate even to the genuine external pressures the empire faced. Some of the explanation is straightforward enough. Mahmud's campaigns into India, while enormously profitable in terms of plunder and tribute, had also stretched Ghaznavid military and administrative resources across an unusually vast territory, and historians generally agree that the empire's core administrative and military structures were built around a model of continuous expansion and extraction, rather than sustainable long-term governance of settled, diverse territories. When the pace of profitable conquest slowed, particularly after Mahmud's death, the fiscal and military system built to support near-constant campaigning came under increasing strain, a structural vulnerability that made the empire considerably less resilient when a serious external challenge, in the form of the Seljuks, finally emerged. This explanation, grounded in the practical mechanics of medieval steppe-adjacent empire building, accounts for a great deal of the Ghaznavid vulnerability, without requiring any explanation beyond ordinary administrative and military overreach. And yet, the specific pattern of internal Ghaznavid politics in the decades following Dandanakan raises questions this explanation alone does not fully resolve. Bayhaqi's detailed court history describes Mas'ud's reign as afflicted by an unusually corrosive atmosphere of court intrigue, competing factions among military commanders, and a persistent, difficult-to-fully-trace pattern of key advisors and generals shifting loyalty at crucial moments, sometimes in ways that appear to have directly undermined the empire's ability to respond effectively to the Seljuk threat when it mattered most. Why, precisely, did certain key Ghaznavid commanders hesitate or delay at critical junctures before Dandanakan? Decisions that later chroniclers describe with evident frustration, but without always offering a fully satisfying account of the underlying motivations involved. Was this simply the ordinary friction of medieval court politics, the kind of factional maneuvering common to nearly every pre-modern empire under strain? Or does it suggest something more specific? Perhaps deeper resentments within the Ghaznavid military and administrative elite toward Mas'ud's rule personally. Resentments whose full scope and origin are not fully reconstructible from the surviving sources, however detailed Bayhaqi's account otherwise is. The question grows more pointed still when one considers the empire's later history, well past the immediate crisis of Mas'ud's reign. Even after the Ghaznavids stabilized their reduced eastern territories and continued as a regional power for another century, the dynasty experienced a strikingly persistent pattern of succession disputes, court assassinations, and periodic internal violence that seems to exceed what purely external pressure from Seljuk, or later Ghurid rivals, would necessarily produce on its own. Some historians of the period have suggested that the trauma and loss of legitimacy associated with the Dandanakan defeat itself may have left a lasting mark on Ghaznavid political culture. weakening the dynasty's claim to unquestioned authority in ways that made every subsequent succession more contested and more vulnerable to factional maneuvering than it might otherwise have been, a kind of long institutional aftershock following the initial military catastrophe. This is a plausible psychological and political explanation, though by its nature difficult to verify with the same confidence as a clearly dated battle or a specific administrative record. The empire's final end in 1186, when the rising Ghurid dynasty captured Lahore and extinguished the last remnant of Ghaznavid rule, is reasonably well documented in its immediate circumstances, but historians continue to debate precisely how much of that final collapse should be attributed to the accumulated long-term structural weaknesses traceable all the way back to Dandanakan, a century and a half earlier, versus how much reflects simply the specific, more immediate military and political strength of the Ghurids as a rising regional power in their own right, largely independent of whatever lingering weaknesses the Ghaznavids may have still carried from their earlier defeat. Untangling long-term structural decline from more immediate situational military defeat is a challenge common to the history of many fading medieval empires, and the Ghaznavid case is no exception. Complicated further by the relative thinness of surviving administrative records from the dynasty's final century, compared to the richer documentation available for its earlier, more celebrated period under Mahmud and Mas'ud. There is, additionally, a persistent and less thoroughly resolved question surrounding the fate of Ghaznavid court records, artistic works, and administrative archives following the eventual Ghurid conquest of Ghazni itself in 1150, an earlier and separate sack of the city that predates the dynasty's final extinction in Lahore by several decades. Contemporary chroniclers describe this earlier Ghurid assault on Ghazni in terms of considerable destruction, and modern archaeological and art historical scholars have long noted how comparatively little survives today of the material, culture, and documentary record of what was, by all contemporary accounts, one of the great courts of the medieval Islamic world at its height. Some scholars have proposed that a genuinely substantial portion of Ghaznavid court archives, artistic production, and scholarly work, including material connected to figures like al-Biruni and Ferdowsi's own patrons, may have been lost specifically in this mid-12th century destruction of the city, a loss whose full extent is difficult to assess precisely because the destroyed material can, by definition, no longer speak for itself. What remains, in the end, is a familiar shape within this history. An empire whose broad rise and fall is documented clearly enough in its outward events, yet whose deeper internal workings, the true motivations behind key wartime hesitations, the full texture of court intrigue that shaped a century and a half of troubled succession, and the precise scale of what was lost when Ghazni itself was sacked and largely erased from the physical record, remain considerably harder to reconstruct with full confidence. The two minarets still standing at Ghazni today rise from ground that once held palaces, libraries, and the accumulated administrative memory of one of the great powers of the medieval Islamic world. Whether the deeper causes of that empire's long unraveling were simply the ordinary mechanics of overextension and rival ambition, or concealed some more specific human drama within the Ghaznavid court that the surviving chronicles only partially capture, is a question the brick and dust of Ghazni have so far kept largely to themselves. Some 7,000 miles east of Ghazni's silent minarets, across an ocean and a continent, another network of exchange and belief was also unraveling in these same medieval centuries. This one leaving behind not brick towers but stone rooms pressed into canyon walls, and turquoise beads that traveled farther than anyone who wore them ever did. Picture Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico, where Pueblo Bonito rises from the canyon floor, a massive, multi-story complex of sandstone masonry containing more than 600 rooms. built and expanded in stages between roughly 850 and 1150 AD by ancestral Pueblo peoples. From the air, Chaco Canyon reveals something remarkable: a network of wide, engineered roads radiating outward from the canyon in arrow straight lines, some extending over 60 kilometers to outlying settlements across the San Juan Basin. Roads that were built with a formal, deliberate engineering effort, disproportionate to what simple foot traffic between settlements would seem to require. Excavations throughout Chaco's great houses have recovered turquoise in extraordinary quantities, along with copper bells, macaw feathers, and cacao residue on ceramic vessels. Items whose origins lie hundreds, and, in the case of the macaws and cacao, well over 1,000 kilometers to the south in Mesoamerica. Chaco Canyon, in other words, sat at the center of an extensive, sophisticated exchange network connecting the American Southwest to civilizations as far away as central Mexico. And then, within a relatively narrow span of time in the 12th and 13th centuries, that network, along with the society that had built it, unraveled. The mainstream archaeological explanation for Chaco's decline rests on a reasonably solid foundation of environmental and social evidence. Tree ring records from the region, among the most precisely dated in North American archaeology, reveal a series of severe droughts beginning in the mid-1100s, compounding what appears to have already been a marginal agricultural environment straining to support a population that had grown considerably during Chaco's height. Some archaeologists have also proposed that the very success of the Chacoan system may have contained the seeds of its own instability, with a complex hierarchical social and religious structure built up over generations becoming increasingly difficult to sustain once the agricultural surplus and long-distance trade that had funded its ceremonial architecture and elite class began to falter under sustained environmental stress. By the mid-1100s, construction of major structures at Chaco itself had slowed dramatically, and by around 1150, the canyon's role as a major population and ceremonial center appears to have diminished substantially, with population and architectural focus shifting to other regional centers, including sites further north such as Aztec ruins, before those centers, too, were eventually abandoned in favor of the well-documented later Pueblo communities along the Rio Grande, and in areas like the Hopi Mesas, whose descendants continue to live in the region today. This explanation accounts for the broad arc of decline reasonably well, and importantly, it does not describe an extinction or a true disappearance of any people. Ancestral Pueblo populations did not vanish, but rather relocated, reorganized, and continued as the direct ancestors of contemporary Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi, Zuni, and the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley, who maintain their own oral traditions regarding this period of migration and transformation. What remains considerably less settled, however, is the specific fate and mechanics of the long-distance trade network itself, separate from the question of population movement, and here the evidence becomes notably harder to pin down with the same confidence. The presence of scarlet macaws at Chaco, for instance, is one of the more striking and still only partially explained aspects of the site. These birds, native to tropical regions of Mexico and further south, could not have survived transport across such distances without careful, sustained human effort, implying an established network capable of moving live animals across enormous stretches of desert and mountain terrain, likely through multiple intermediary trading partners along the way, none of whom left behind their own written record of the exchange. Archaeologists have identified what appears to have been a macaw breeding operation at the nearby site of Paquimé, in what is now northern Chihuahua, Mexico, dating somewhat later than Chaco's peak, which raises an intriguing question about the network's own internal evolution. Did the specific routes and mechanisms of exchange shift southward as Chaco itself declined, with Paquimé emerging as a kind of successor node in a network that had never entirely depended on Chaco Canyon as its sole northern anchor? Or did the disruption at Chaco represent a more fundamental break in the trade system, with Paquime's later prominence reflecting an essentially separate, later phase of long-distance exchange rather than direct continuity from the earlier Chacoan network? Compounding this uncertainty is the difficult question of who, precisely, managed and organized this trade across such a vast distance in the first place, and what specific social or religious mechanisms bound such geographically dispersed communities into a functioning exchange system without the kind of centralized political apparatus that might typically be associated with large-scale trade networks elsewhere in the ancient world. No ancestral Pueblo written record survived to describe the administrative or diplomatic mechanics of this trade, since these societies did not employ writing systems in the way that, for example, Mesoamerican civilizations to the south did. What we know comes almost entirely from the material remains themselves. The objects, their find locations, their chemical and stylistic sourcing to specific distant regions, combined with careful, ongoing consultation with contemporary Pueblo communities regarding oral traditions that address, in culturally specific and often deliberately non-public ways, the history and meaning of this period. Archaeologists increasingly recognize that a full understanding of Chaco's trade network and its eventual transformation likely requires exactly this kind of careful, collaborative engagement. Given that the descendant communities themselves retain forms of knowledge about this history that were never intended for, or fully translatable into, the archaeological record alone. There is also the specific, still debated question of why the road network itself was built to the scale and precision it was, given that the volume of actual goods being transported, at least as reconstructed from surviving material evidence, seems in some cases disproportionately modest relative to the substantial engineering investment the roads represent. Some archaeologists have proposed that the roads served purposes beyond purely practical trade logistics, potentially carrying significant ceremonial or cosmological meaning tied to specific alignments, pilgrimage routes, or ritual movement between Chaco and its outlying communities, a function that would help explain their formal, deliberately engineered character even in cases where the practical trade volume alone might not obviously justify it. This interpretation remains an active and reasonable area of ongoing research rather than a settled conclusion, and it illustrates a broader challenge running through the study of Chaco's decline, separating the specifically economic collapse of a trade network from the parallel, likely deeply intertwined collapse or transformation of the religious and social systems that gave that trade its full meaning and organizing structure in the first place. What we are left with, then, is a landscape covered in the physical remnants of an extensive, sophisticated exchange system. Turquoise mined locally and worked into ornaments that traveled south, macaws and copper bells and cacao carried north across improbable distances, roads engineered with a precision that still puzzles researchers studying their full purpose. The broad environmental and social pressures that brought Chaco's central role to an end are reasonably well understood, and the ancestral Pueblo peoples themselves did not disappear, continuing instead as the ancestors of thriving contemporary communities who carry their own knowledge of this history forward in their own way. But the precise mechanics of how so vast and specific a trading network organized itself across such enormous distances without centralized writing, or, as far as current evidence shows, a single unifying imperial authority, and exactly how and why that network transformed or fractured as Chaco's central role diminished, remains an active area of patient, ongoing archaeological and collaborative investigation rather than a fully closed case. Somewhere beneath the sand and sagebrush of the San Juan Basin, along roads that once carried traders, pilgrims, or both across the desert toward a canyon whose ceremonial importance outlasted its practical political power, further answers likely still wait. Not about whether a people vanished, since we know they did not, but about the finer, still only partially understood texture of the vast, interconnected world they built, sustained, and eventually reshaped into something new. A network built without centralized writing, its full meaning surviving only in fragments and oral memory. That same problem, in an entirely different form, confronts us now in the far north, where a king who prized the written word above almost any of his contemporaries left behind a body of learning, whose fate afterward is almost as obscure as the trade routes we've just traced through the American desert. Picture the royal hall at Bergen, on Norway's western coast, in the final years of the 12th century, where King Sverre Sigurdsson held court after one of the most improbable and violent ascents to power in medieval Scandinavian history. Sverre's own life is unusually well documented for a Norwegian king of this period, thanks to Sverre's Saga, a chronicle believed to have been composed, at least in its earliest sections, under Sverre's own direction and possibly with his direct input, making it one of the more distinctive royal narratives to survive from medieval Scandinavia. A king who took an active hand in shaping the historical record of his own reign. Sverre had been raised, according to the saga tradition, with a clerical education, initially intended for the priesthood before his claimed royal lineage and subsequent military campaign carried him instead to the Norwegian throne in 1184, following years of civil war against the ruling Magnus Erlingsson. Once in power, Sverre proved to be an unusually literate and intellectually engaged monarch by the standards of his era, someone who understood the political value of texts, chronicles, and learned argument, most famously demonstrated in his prolonged and bitter conflict with the Archbishop of Nidaros and the wider Norwegian Church, a dispute conducted substantially through competing written justifications and theological argument rather than through military confrontation alone. It is against this backdrop, a king notably invested in the written word, ruling during a period when Norway's ecclesiastical and monastic institutions were actively building their own manuscript collections. That later tradition and scattered historical references point toward the existence of some form of royal library or scriptorium associated with Sverre's court, a body of texts assembled or commissioned under his patronage that would have reflected both his own education and his evident interest in using written argument as a tool of statecraft. Compared to the well-documented royal and monastic libraries of contemporary England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, however, the specific scope, content, and ultimate fate of whatever collection existed under Sverre remained considerably less certain, resting on a much thinner evidentiary base than the grander mysteries of libraries like Cairo's Dar al-Ilm that we explored earlier in this history. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: medieval Norway, during Sverre's reign and in the decades immediately following it, was actively producing and preserving substantial written material, evidenced most directly by the survival of works like Sverre's Saga itself, along with other contemporary or near-contemporary Norwegian historical writing produced in this same general period. Bergen, where Sverre based much of his later reign, was an important royal and ecclesiastical center, and historians generally accept that some organized body of texts, royal correspondence, legal documents, chronicle material, and likely theological or polemical writing connected to the church conflict would have existed there in some form to support the kind of literate governance the saga describes Sverre practicing. The existence of some collection of texts under royal patronage during this period is, in this general sense, entirely plausible and consistent with broader patterns of learning and manuscript production across Christian Scandinavia in the 12th and 13th centuries. Where the historical record becomes considerably thinner is in any specific accounting of what such a collection actually contained, how extensive it was, and precisely what happened to it following Sverre's death in 1202 and the subsequent decades of continued civil conflict that troubled Norway well into the 13th century. Unlike more thoroughly documented medieval library losses, where chroniclers describe specific catastrophic events, a fire, a military sack, a deliberate dispersal ordered by a named authority, no comparably detailed contemporary account survives to explain definitively what became of whatever textual material had been assembled around Sverre's court. This absence is not, on its own, unusual. Medieval Scandinavian archival survival generally is considerably thinner than in better documented regions of Western Europe, owing to a combination of factors, including the relatively smaller scale of Norwegian ecclesiastical and royal institutions compared to major continental centers, the destructive effects of later fires that are known to have repeatedly damaged Bergen across subsequent centuries, and the simple attrition that affects manuscript survival everywhere over the span of 8 centuries. This combination of plausible existence and genuinely thin documentation is precisely what has allowed the subject to become something of an open question among historians of medieval Norway, rather than either a fully established fact or a clearly dismissed legend. Some historians studying Sverre's reign and the broader intellectual culture of his court have suggested that a meaningful body of material, quite possibly including texts directly relevant to his church conflict and his own claimed royal genealogy, existed and was maintained during his reign, only to be lost or scattered amid the continued political instability that persisted in Norway for decades after his death, a period during which royal authority, ecclesiastical power, and control over Bergen itself shifted repeatedly among competing factions. Under this reading, whatever collection existed may have suffered a fate similar to many medieval royal archives caught in prolonged periods of civil conflict, not necessarily destroyed in any single dramatic event, but gradually dispersed, damaged, or simply left uncatalogued and eventually lost to the ordinary attrition of time, war, and changing institutional priorities, its individual texts either destroyed outright or absorbed piecemeal into other ecclesiastical or royal collections without retaining any clear marker of their original Sverre-era provenance. Others take a more cautious view, noting that the evidence for any organized library, in a more formal sense, as opposed to a more modest and administratively ordinary set of royal and ecclesiastical documents, is thin enough that considerable caution is warranted before assuming the existence of anything resembling the grander royal or monastic manuscript collections documented elsewhere in medieval Europe during this same period. On this reading, later tradition and popular historical writing may have, over the centuries, somewhat inflated a genuinely more modest set of administrative and chronicle-related material into something closer to a formal, lost royal library. A natural enough tendency, given how compelling the idea of a vanished collection of medieval texts tends to be to later writers and readers alike, regardless of how well the underlying evidence actually supports so grand a characterization. Bergen's own subsequent history complicates any effort to resolve this question further. The city suffered repeated major fires throughout the medieval and early modern periods, events that are well documented to have destroyed substantial quantities of records, buildings, and material culture across multiple distinct episodes over the following centuries, making it entirely plausible that whatever documentary material survived from Sverre's own era, in whatever quantity it originally existed, could easily have been lost in any one of several later catastrophic events, long after the original political and ecclesiastical conflicts of Sverre's reign had themselves faded into settled history. This makes definitively distinguishing the specific fate of any Sverre-era material from the much broader pattern of general medieval Norwegian document loss a genuinely difficult task for historians working with what limited source material actually survives. What remains, in the end, is a genuinely open historical question rather than a fully resolved mystery. A king whose personal engagement with the written word is well established through the survival of Sverris saga itself, ruling during a period of active manuscript production across Christian Scandinavia, and yet whose broader library or archive, if it existed in anything like the scale later tradition sometimes implies, left behind no clear contemporary account of its specific contents or its ultimate fate. Perhaps only a modest collection ever existed, gradually absorbed into other institutions and lost to the ordinary erosion of 8 intervening centuries. Or perhaps a more substantial body of Sverre-era texts once stood in Bergen, a genuine record of one of medieval Scandinavia's most literate and politically astute kings, before civil war, repeated fire, and the passage of time did to it what so much of the medieval written record has quietly suffered elsewhere, leaving behind only the certainty that a literate king once valued such texts enough to have them made, and no certainty at all about where the fullest record of that literacy ultimately went, the scratch of a quill on vellum, forming letters that no scholar has ever fully read. That is the sound and the image this chapter opens on, though the hand holding the quill this time may belong to someone considerably closer to our own era than the medieval scribes we have followed so far. Picture a small, unassuming manuscript held today in the library of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in Budapest, the Rock-Hewn Codex, 448 pages of dense, unfamiliar script accompanied by roughly 87 illustrations depicting religious, military, and everyday scenes, written in a writing system that no scholar has yet definitively deciphered or matched to any known language. The codex takes its name from the Hungarian town of Rohank, now Rechnitz in Austria, where it was first recorded in the collection of Count Gustav Battiani, before being donated to the Academy in 1838. Its script bears no confirmed resemblance to any known alphabet, and its physical characteristics, along with the peculiar circumstances of its documented history, have made it one of the more persistent unsolved puzzles in European manuscript studies, frequently compared to the far more famous Voynich manuscript, another undeciphered text whose own mysteries have generated considerably more popular attention over the past century. The verified history of the Rock-Hewn Codex, such as it can be reconstructed, begins with genuine uncertainty about even its most basic facts. Paper analysis conducted in more recent decades has helped narrow down the likely period of the manuscript's physical creation, with most researchers now placing its production somewhere in the range of the late 16th to early 18th century, based on watermark evidence and paper composition, considerably later than some of the more romantic early theories once suggested. This dating itself represents a meaningful scholarly advance over the 19th century, when the Codex's true age was essentially unknown, and speculation about its origin ranged freely across several centuries and multiple possible regions of composition. What has proven far more resistant to resolution is the actual content and purpose of the text itself. The script consists of several hundred distinct symbols, considerably more than would be expected of a simple alphabetic system representing a single spoken language, a characteristic that has led most serious cryptographic and linguistic researchers examining the codex to conclude that it likely does not represent straightforward alphabetic writing at all, but rather some more complex system, possibly involving syllabic elements, logographic components representing whole words or concepts, or some combination of encoding methods that current analytical techniques have not yet successfully untangled. Statistical analysis of the text, including studies of symbol frequency and distribution patterns conducted by several independent researchers using computational methods, has generally found patterns broadly consistent with genuine linguistic structure, rather than pure randomness. A finding that has been cited by some as evidence the codex likely does encode a real underlying language or message. However successfully, its specific system continues to resist decipherment. This is where the central, most persistent controversy surrounding the Rock-Hewn Codex genuinely divides serious scholars, and it is worth stating plainly that this divide is not between mainstream historians and fringe theorists, but runs directly through the community of researchers who have devoted serious, sustained attention to the manuscript. One substantial body of scholarly opinion holds that the codex is most likely a 19th century forgery or hoax, created specifically to deceive collectors, with suspicion frequently centering on Samuel Literati Nemes, a documented Hungarian antiquities dealer and known forger active during exactly the period when the codex first entered the historical record through the Battiani collection. Nemes is independently documented, through other confirmed cases, to have produced and sold fraudulent historical artifacts and manuscripts to collectors during this period, making him a genuinely plausible candidate for having also produced the Rock-Hewn Codex as an elaborate forgery designed to appear ancient and mysterious to potential buyers, exploiting the same 19th century romantic fascination with undeciphered ancient scripts that would later fuel interest in manuscripts like the Voynich as well. Under this reading, the apparent linguistic structure identified through statistical analysis might reflect not a genuine underlying language, but rather patterns introduced, consciously or unconsciously, by a forger attempting to create a text that merely resembled authentic writing, closely enough to pass casual inspection, without the text necessarily encoding any real, recoverable message at all. Set against this view is a competing body of more recent scholarship, including analysis published by several linguists and historians in the past 2 decades, which has proposed that the codex may in fact represent a genuine, if highly unusual, religious text, quite possibly composed by a devout Christian author working in a linguistic and cultural context somewhere in Eastern Europe, potentially reflecting Hungarian, Romanian, or other regional linguistic influences filtered through an invented or highly modified writing system created for reasons that remain themselves unclear, whether religious secrecy, personal devotional practice, or some other motivation specific to its unknown author. Some researchers working from this position have proposed partial readings of specific passages, suggesting correspondences with known biblical or liturgical content that would be consistent with a genuine devotional purpose rather than an elaborate deception, though these proposed partial decipherments remain contested and have not achieved anything approaching broad scholarly consensus, with critics arguing that apparent correspondences to religious text could as easily reflect the natural human tendency to find meaningful patterns in ambiguous material, a phenomenon well documented across the broader history of undeciphered script analysis. This unresolved tension between the forgery hypothesis and the genuine text hypothesis is compounded by a further layer of uncertainty surrounding the codex's illustrations, which depict scenes including what appear to be religious processions, military encounters, and figures in clothing and settings that some researchers have attempted to date or geographically place based on stylistic analysis, with proposed connections ranging across various Eastern and Southeastern European Christian traditions. Though none of these visual analyses has produced conclusions specific or widely accepted enough to definitively settle the broader question of the manuscript's true origin, authorship, or purpose. What makes the Rock-Hewn Codex a particularly instructive case within the broader history of undeciphered manuscripts is precisely this genuine scholarly division, which stands in contrast to cases where popular fascination vastly outpaces serious academic engagement. Here, the disagreement exists at the level of careful, published, peer-reviewed research conducted by specialists in linguistics, cryptography and manuscript history, several of whom have reached materially different conclusions using broadly similar analytical methods. A reminder of how genuinely difficult the problem of authenticating and interpreting an isolated, undeciphered text can be even when subjected to rigorous modern scholarly scrutiny rather than casual speculation. The question of whether other related manuscripts might exist, either as direct precursors to whatever system or tradition the Rock-Hewn Codex represents, or as related works produced by the same hand or tradition, remains almost entirely unexplored territory, largely because researchers have not yet reached sufficient consensus on the Codex's own basic nature to confidently search for comparable material elsewhere. If the Codex is indeed a 19th century forgery, the search for genuine precursors becomes, in an important sense, a search for the wrong kind of object entirely, since a forger's invented script would not necessarily have any authentic historical lineage to trace at all. However carefully, it might have been constructed to appear as though it did. If, alternatively, the Codex does represent a genuine, if idiosyncratic, devotional or linguistic tradition, the question of whether related texts exist in overlooked regional archives, private collections, or misattributed manuscript holdings elsewhere in Eastern Europe remains a legitimate and largely unaddressed avenue of research, one complicated by the same basic problem that has hindered decipherment efforts generally. Without first establishing what language or system the Codex actually encodes, researchers have no clear template against which to identify potential related material, even if such material happens to already sit, unrecognized, in some other archive's uncatalogued holdings. This is, in the end, a mystery distinguished less by dramatic disappearance or physical destruction, in the manner of so many other subjects we have explored, and more by a stubborn, ongoing failure of interpretation applied to an object that has never actually gone missing at all. The Rock-Hewn Codex has sat, fully intact and physically accessible, in the same Hungarian institutional collection for nearly 2 centuries, examined repeatedly by successive generations of researchers equipped with increasingly sophisticated analytical tools, and yet its fundamental nature, genuine text or elaborate deception, real language or invented cipher, devotional artifact or collector's hoax, remains as contested today as it was when serious scholarly attention first turned to it in the 20th century. Perhaps continued advances in computational linguistic analysis will eventually settle the question definitively, identifying with confidence whether the Codex's several hundred symbols encode a genuine underlying language, and if so, which one, and what it says across its 448 dense pages. Or perhaps the manuscript will continue to resist resolution indefinitely, a fully preserved, physically present object whose meaning remains as inaccessible as if it had been lost entirely, its true purpose known with certainty only to a single unidentified author, whether a devoted, unconventional scribe or a resourceful 19th century forger who left behind no further explanation of what precisely they had made and why. It is worth pausing here before we return once more to Jerusalem. On a simple observation, this history keeps circling back to some of the most haunting unanswered questions are not about what was destroyed or what vanished, but about what was planned and never carried out at all. That is the shape of the mystery waiting for us now, in the reign of a king whose body failed him even as his mind reached toward a future the rest of his kingdom would never see. Picture the royal court of Jerusalem in the late 1170s, where King Baldwin IV received foreign dignitaries and issued royal charters from behind a face increasingly ravaged by leprosy, a disease first noticed, according to the near-contemporary chronicler William of Tyre, in Baldwin's childhood, when the future king reportedly failed to react to pain while playing with other boys, a detail that convinced his tutor something was seriously wrong, even before the diagnosis was confirmed. Baldwin ascended to the throne of Jerusalem in 1174 at just 13 years old, and would rule for 11 years despite a condition that grew steadily more debilitating, eventually costing him his sight and much of the use of his limbs, forcing him in his final years to be carried into battle on a litter rather than mounted on horseback as a Crusader king was expected to be. William of Tyre, who served as Baldwin's own tutor and later as a senior official in his court, wrote of him with evident personal admiration, describing a young king who governed with unusual intelligence, political skill, and personal courage despite the mounting physical toll of his illness, most famously leading Crusader forces to a celebrated victory over Saladin's much larger army at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, at just 16 years of age. This much is very well established, resting on William of Tyre's detailed contemporary account, along with corroborating charters, letters, and references in other regional chronicles from the period. What is considerably less clear, and has remained a genuine subject of historical debate, concerns the specific political and dynastic plans Baldwin was actively pursuing in his final years, as his illness progressed to the point where his own capacity to rule directly was clearly, and by his own evident awareness, approaching its end. Baldwin's central political problem, well documented by William of Tyre and later historians alike, was succession. His leprosy meant he could never marry or produce an heir of his own body, leaving the succession to depend entirely on his half-sisters, Sibylla and Isabella, and more specifically on whichever husbands they took, since medieval succession in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as in most contemporary European monarchies, would pass functional royal authority to a woman's husband rather than to the woman as sole ruling monarch in her own right. Sibylla's first husband, William of Montferrat, died shortly after their marriage in 1177, leaving Sibylla's young son, later Baldwin Fief, as one clear line of succession, while Sibylla herself soon after remarried, controversially to Guy of Lusignan, a match that William of Tyre and other contemporary sources describe Baldwin as viewing with real and escalating alarm, as Guy's political competence and judgment came increasingly into question during the final years of Baldwin's reign. What historians continue to debate, working from William of Tyre's own detailed, but not fully transparent account, alongside scattered charter evidence, is precisely what alternative arrangement, if any, Baldwin was actively working toward in his final year or two of life, as his health failed dramatically, and his ability to personally hold the fractious Jerusalem nobility together diminished in step with his physical strength. William of Tyre's chronicle describes Baldwin as having grown deeply distrustful of Guy of Lusignan specifically, to the point of formally stripping Guy of the regency he had briefly held during one of Baldwin's periods of incapacitation, and instead arranging before his death in 1185 for the succession to pass first to his young nephew Baldwin Thithif, Sibylla's son from her first marriage, with a regency council intended to govern until the child came of age. This much is reasonably well documented as Baldwin's stated final arrangement. Yet the deeper question, whether Baldwin had, in his final years, actively pursued or seriously considered some more permanent alternative solution to the succession crisis, beyond simply buying time with a child regency that could not, in the nature of things, resolve the underlying dynastic problem indefinitely, remains genuinely contested among historians studying this period. Some scholars, reading William of Tyre's evident personal hostility toward Guy of Lusignan, alongside scattered references to ongoing diplomatic contacts with European royal houses during Baldwin's final years, have proposed that Baldwin may have been actively exploring the possibility of arranging a different marriage for Sibylla entirely, potentially seeking an annulment of her marriage to Guy in favor of a match with a candidate Baldwin considered more capable of the military and political leadership the kingdom would soon require, given the mounting external pressure from Saladin's increasingly unified and powerful Ayyubid state. Direct documentary evidence of any such specific alternative marriage plan, however, is notably thin, resting more on inference from Baldwin's well-documented distrust of Guy than on any surviving letter, charter, or explicit chronicle statement laying out a concrete alternative succession strategy Baldwin was actively pursuing. This gap in the evidence matters considerably because of what followed Baldwin's death. Baldwin V, the child king, died in 1186 after barely a year on the throne, and Sibylla, in the ensuing succession crisis, moved swiftly to have herself crowned queen alongside Guy of Lusignan as her king consort, in a controversial and contested process that several of the kingdom's leading nobles opposed but ultimately failed to prevent. Guy's subsequent reign proved to be exactly the catastrophe Baldwin, if William of Tyre's account is to be trusted, had feared, culminating in the disastrous Battle of Hattin in 1187, the crushing defeat that led directly to Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem itself later that same year, the very city whose fall and its missing crown jewels we explored earlier in this history. Given this outcome, historians have naturally been drawn to ask, with the considerable benefit of hindsight, whether Baldwin's own final political maneuvering, had he lived longer, or had his preferred arrangement been fully carried out and sustained after his death, might have averted the catastrophe that followed so closely on the heels of his passing. This is ultimately a mystery of intention rather than of missing objects or vanished peoples. A question of what a dying king, watching his kingdom's fate depend on relatives whose judgment he did not fully trust, was actually attempting to arrange in his final months, and how much of that plan, whatever its precise shape, was cut short by his own death before it could be fully realized or tested. William of Tyre's chronicle gives us Baldwin's evident anxiety and his documented actions against Guy with real clarity, but it does not give us a clean, explicit statement of Baldwin's full intended solution, if indeed he had settled on one at all, rather than continuing, as many rulers facing an insoluble succession problem often do, to manage the crisis incrementally without ever arriving at a single, fully formed final plan. Did Baldwin IV die with a genuine alternative succession strategy still in motion, one that might have spared Jerusalem the catastrophe of Hattin had it been allowed to unfold, or was his final year spent instead in the more limited, reactive maneuvering that the surviving evidence more cautiously supports, buying time rather than truly solving a crisis that may, in the end, have had no clean solution available to him at all? The young king's own voice on this question was never directly recorded for us to consult, and the kingdom he left behind collapsed within 2 years of his death, carrying whatever fuller understanding he may have possessed of his own intentions down with him into a grave that, like so much else from this period, has left us only the outline of a plan and none of its missing details.